It was March 1941. The Battle of Cape Matapan was already unfolding, but what was about to happen would turn into one of the most devastating naval encounters of the war, not because of numbers, but because of precision, timing, and total surprise. Out there, the Italian fleet believed they still had control of the night. Their ships, heavy cruisers and destroyers, cut through the water with confidence, unaware that their greatest disadvantage was not firepower, but visibility. Because in the darkness, something had changed. The British had learned how to see, using newly developed radar still unfamiliar. Still experimental, the Royal Navy was no longer blind after sunset. And that night, 3 destroyers moved like shadows across the water. No lights, no warnings. They closed the distance in silence, until suddenly, the darkness exploded. Searchlights cut through the night. Guns roared to life. And in just minutes, mere moments in the scale of war, the balance shifted completely. What followed was not a prolonged battle. It was a shock, collapse, a devastating encounter where confusion met precision, and numbers meant nothing. In just 28 minutes, 10 Italian warships would be lost. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Britain War Diaries, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Mediterranean before the storm. Before the night of sudden flashes and shattered silhouettes, before the roar of naval guns tore through the stillness of the sea, the Mediterranean in early 1941 existed in a fragile and uncertain balance, a vast expanse of water that carried not only fleets and supplies, but also the weight of strategic ambition from both sides of the war. And within this contested environment, control of the sea was never absolute, but constantly shifting, shaped by intelligence, timing, and the ability to act decisively in moments of opportunity. And it is within this broader setting that the events leading to the Battle of Cape Matapan must be understood, not as an isolated clash, but as part of a larger struggle for dominance in a region where every movement could have far-reaching consequences. And during this period, the Royal Navy was tasked with maintaining vital supply routes, ensuring that resources could move across the Mediterranean despite the persistent threat posed by opposing forces. And these routes were not simply lines on a map, but lifelines that connected distant fronts, carrying fuel, equipment, and reinforcements that were essential to sustaining the broader war effort. And any disruption to these routes had the potential to alter the balance of power, making the control of the sea a matter of strategic necessity rather than mere advantage. And on the other side, the Regia Marina sought to assert its presence and challenge British operations, operating from bases that allowed it to project power into key areas of the Mediterranean. And while both sides possessed significant naval strength, the nature of their strategies differed, shaped by their respective resources, technologies, and doctrines. And as these strategies unfolded, the sea itself became a space of constant movement and anticipation, where fleets maneuvered not only to engage, but to position themselves for the right moment. And it is important to recognize that much of naval warfare during this time depended not on direct confrontation, but on the ability to detect, track, and outmaneuver the enemy. And in this regard, information became as valuable as firepower, with reconnaissance and intelligence playing a crucial role in shaping decisions. And as March 1941 approached, reports and signals began to suggest increased activity within the Mediterranean, creating a sense that a larger engagement might be imminent. And within this atmosphere of expectation, commanders on both sides were forced to interpret incomplete information, making decisions based on what they could infer rather than what they could see. And this uncertainty added a layer of complexity to naval operations, as the vastness of the sea made it possible for fleets to remain hidden even as they moved into position. And it is within this context that the stage was set for the events at Matapan, where the convergence of movement, timing, and technology would create a moment that would stand out. not only for its outcome, but for the way in which it unfolded. And as we consider this period, it becomes clear that the calm surface of the Mediterranean concealed a growing tension, one that would soon be released in a sudden and decisive encounter, and that the events of that night were not simply the result of chance, but the culmination of a series of decisions, movements, and developments that had been building beneath the surface, shaping the conditions under which the battle would take place. And in this way, the story of Matapan begins not with the clash itself, but with the quiet, deliberate movements that preceded it, as fleets moved across the water unseen and uncertain, toward a moment that would reveal the true nature of naval warfare in the age of emerging technology. As the Mediterranean continued to serve as a critical arena for naval operations, the evolving nature of warfare began to introduce new elements that would fundamentally alter how engagements were conducted, and among these elements, one of the most significant was the development and integration of radar technology, a tool that, while still in its early stages, offered the potential to transform the way fleets detected and responded to one another, and for the Royal Navy, the adoption of radar represented a shift toward a more information-driven approach to combat, allowing ships to identify targets beyond visual range and, crucially, to operate with greater confidence in conditions of limited visibility. And this capability would prove particularly important in the context of night operations, where traditional methods of detection were often unreliable, and where the ability to see without being seen could provide a decisive advantage. And yet, despite its potential, radar was not a universally understood or fully trusted technology, and its effectiveness depended not only on the equipment itself, but on the training and coordination of the crews who operated it. And as such, its integration into naval strategy was a gradual process, one that required adaptation and experimentation, and it is within this period of transition that the events leading to Matapan took place, as the Royal Navy began to explore how this new capability could be used to enhance its operations, particularly in the context of night engagements. And on the opposing side, the Regia Marina relied more heavily on traditional methods of detection and engagement, placing emphasis on visual identification and coordination under conditions where visibility could be a limiting factor. And while this approach had proven effective in certain contexts, it also introduced vulnerabilities, particularly in situations where the enemy possessed the ability to detect and engage from beyond visual range. And as these differing approaches to technology and strategy began to shape the behavior of each fleet, they also set the stage for an encounter in which these differences would become critically important. And in the days leading up to the battle, movements across the Mediterranean reflected a growing convergence, as British and Italian forces maneuvered in response to intelligence and perceived opportunities. And these movements were not random, but carefully considered actions aimed at positioning each fleet for a potential engagement. And yet, despite this careful planning, the vastness of the sea ensured that much remained uncertain, with each side operating under conditions where the exact location and intentions of the other could only be estimated. And this uncertainty added an element of tension to every decision, as commanders weighed the risks and possibilities inherent in their actions. And as the night of the engagement approached, the stage was set for a confrontation that would bring these elements together, combining the strategic importance of the Mediterranean, the evolving role of technology, and the inherent unpredictability of naval warfare into a single moment. And it is this combination that makes the events at Matapan so significant, as they illustrate not only the outcome of a battle, but the way in which new capabilities and changing conditions could influence the course of events. And as we move closer to that moment, it becomes clear that what would unfold was not simply a clash of ships, but a demonstration of how the nature of warfare itself was changing, shaped by innovation, adaptation, and the ability to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. And in this way, the calm before the storm was not merely a pause, but a period of preparation, where the elements that would define the battle were already in motion, waiting for the moment when they would converge in the darkness of the Mediterranean night. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The fleets begin to move. As March 1941 unfolded across the Mediterranean, the stillness that had defined the surface of the sea began to give way to deliberate movement, as fleets that had once operated at a cautious distance now started to shift their positions with greater purpose. And within this evolving environment, the actions of the Regia Marina became increasingly significant, as intelligence reports and operational objectives pointed toward a renewed effort to challenge British control in the region. And this effort was not undertaken lightly, but rather as part of a calculated attempt to assert presence and disrupt the balance that had been maintained by the Royal Navy. And as Italian ships began to move out from their bases, they did so with a sense of confidence rooted in both their numbers and their expectation of controlling the engagement on their own terms, and this confidence was shaped by a belief in the effectiveness of their strategy, which emphasized coordination, speed, and the ability to bring concentrated force to bear at the right moment. And yet, beneath this confidence lay an inherent uncertainty, one that stemmed from the difficulty of operating in a vast and dynamic environment where the exact position of the enemy could not always be known. And as the Italian fleet advanced into the Mediterranean, its movements reflected both intention and caution, with formations carefully arranged and communication maintained to ensure cohesion. And these movements were not simply about reaching a destination, but about positioning for an encounter that could unfold at any moment. And it is important to recognize that naval operations during this period required a delicate balance between initiative and restraint, as moving too aggressively could expose a fleet to unforeseen risks, while hesitation could result in missed opportunities. And within this context, the Italian fleet sought to navigate these challenges by maintaining a structured formation that allowed for both flexibility and control. And as they moved through the waters, the sea itself remained deceptively calm, offering no indication of the convergence that was beginning to take shape beneath its surface. And on the other side, the Royal Navy was not unaware of these movements, as signals intelligence and reconnaissance provided indications that Italian forces were becoming more active, and this awareness allowed British commanders to begin formulating a response, one that would rely not only on traditional naval strength, but on the strategic use of emerging technologies and coordinated planning. And as British ships adjusted their positions in response to these developments, they did so with a focus on maintaining situational awareness, using available information to anticipate the movements of the Italian fleet. And this process of anticipation was a critical aspect of naval warfare, as it allowed commanders to act proactively rather than reactively, positioning their forces in a way that maximized their advantage while minimizing exposure. And as both fleets continued to move across the Mediterranean, the distance between them gradually decreased, though neither side had a complete picture of the other's exact location, creating a situation in which each movement carried with it both opportunity and risk. And it is within this narrowing gap that the stage was set for the encounter at Matapan, as the deliberate actions of both fleets brought them closer to a moment that would test their strategies, their coordination, and their ability to respond under pressure. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the battle did not begin with the first exchange of fire, but with the quiet, calculated movements that preceded it, as ships moved through the darkness and uncertainty of the Mediterranean, guided by intention and shaped by the limitations of what could be seen and known. As the distance between the opposing fleets continued to close, the role of information became increasingly critical, shaping not only the movements of each force, but also the decisions made by those in command. And for the Royal Navy, this phase of the operation was defined by a growing reliance on intelligence and coordination, as signals, intercepts, and reconnaissance reports provided valuable insights into the likely position and intentions of the Italian fleet. And while this information was not always complete or entirely precise, it offered a framework within which British commanders could operate, allowing them to plan their movements with a degree of confidence that would prove crucial in the events to come. And within this framework, the integration of radar technology began to play an increasingly important role, as ships equipped with this capability were able to extend their awareness beyond the limitations of visual observation, detecting objects and movements that would otherwise remain hidden in the darkness. And this advantage, while still relatively new, represented a significant shift in the nature of naval operations, as it allowed for a level of situational awareness that had not previously been possible. and as British forces moved into position, they did so with an emphasis on coordination, ensuring that each component of the fleet was aligned with the broader strategy. And this alignment was essential for maintaining cohesion, particularly in a situation where the timing and execution of actions would need to be precise. And on the other side, the Regia Marina continued its advance with a focus on maintaining formation and readiness, relying on established methods of communication and observation to guide its movements. And while these methods had served effectively in many contexts, they were inherently limited by the conditions of the environment, particularly as night approached and visibility began to decrease. And as darkness settled over the Mediterranean, it introduced a new dimension to the unfolding situation, one that would amplify both the strengths and weaknesses of each side. And for the Italian fleet, the night brought with it a degree of uncertainty, as the ability to visually identify and track the enemy was reduced, requiring greater reliance on coordination and assumption. And for the British, the night presented an opportunity, as their use of radar allowed them to maintain awareness even in conditions where the enemy could not, creating a disparity in perception that would become increasingly important as the encounter drew nearer. And as both fleets continued to maneuver, the tension of the situation became more pronounced, not through visible confrontation, but through the knowledge that an engagement was likely imminent, and that the outcome would depend not only on the strength of each fleet, but on their ability to act decisively in the moment. And it is within this growing tension that the significance of the movements leading up to Matapan becomes clear, as they illustrate how the convergence of strategy, technology, and timing can shape the conditions of a battle before it even begins. And as the ships moved through the darkness, guided by incomplete information and differing capabilities, the stage was set for an encounter that would unfold with sudden intensity, transforming the quiet movements of the Mediterranean into a moment of decisive action. And in this way, the approach to Matapan serves as a reminder that the outcome of a battle is often determined long before the first shot is fired, shaped by the choices and movements that bring opposing forces together in the vast and uncertain expanse of the sea. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The First Contact in the Darkness. As the final hours before the encounter slipped quietly into night, the Mediterranean transformed into a vast field of darkness where visibility was reduced to fragments of shadow and faint outlines. And within this environment, the careful movements of both fleets began to take on a new level of significance, as the absence of light removed the certainty that had guided operations during the day, replacing it with a reliance on interpretation, discipline, and in some cases, emerging technology. And it is within this setting that the first moments of contact began to form, not as an immediate clash, but as a gradual realization that the distance between the two forces had narrowed to a point where interaction was no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. And for the Royal Navy, this realization was shaped by the information provided through radar, a capability that allowed them to detect the presence of ships beyond the range of sight, translating the invisible into something that could be understood and acted upon. And as these signals appeared on their instruments, they offered more than just position. They provided an opportunity to control the moment of engagement, to decide not only when to act, but how, and this control was a critical advantage in an environment where the opposing force, the Regia Marina, remained largely dependent on visual detection. And as a result, the Italian ships moved through the darkness with limited awareness of what lay ahead, maintaining formation and readiness, but without a clear understanding of how close they were to the British fleet. And this difference in awareness created a subtle but decisive imbalance, one that would define the opening moments of the encounter. And as British ships adjusted their course and speed, they did so with precision, guided by information that allowed them to position themselves advantageously, closing the distance in silence while maintaining coordination across the fleet. And this silent approach was not simply a matter of stealth, but a deliberate strategy designed to maximize the element of surprise, ensuring that when the moment came, it would unfold on terms that favored those who had prepared for it. And within this context, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath, the surface calm and undisturbed even as the forces within it moved toward convergence. And as the distance between the fleets continued to decrease, the tension that had been building throughout. The day reached a point where it could no longer remain unexpressed. And yet, even at this stage, the encounter had not fully revealed itself, existing instead as a potential that hovered just beyond the edge of perception. And it is this moment, this narrow space between awareness and action, that defines the beginning of the engagement at Matapan, as it represents the transition from movement to confrontation, from preparation to execution. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the first contact was not marked by a sudden explosion of activity, but by a series of calculated decisions that brought the fleets into alignment, setting the stage for what would follow. And in this way, the darkness of the Mediterranean was not merely a backdrop, but an active element in the unfolding of events, shaping what could be seen, what could be known, and ultimately what could be done. As the moment of engagement drew closer, the difference in perception between the two fleets began to manifest more clearly, shaping the way in which each side approached the unfolding situation. And for the Royal Navy, the ability to detect the Italian ships through radar created a sense of controlled anticipation, as commanders were able to observe the relative position and movement of their targets without revealing their own presence. And this allowed for a level of coordination that extended beyond individual ships, enabling the fleet to act as a unified force, with each component positioned to contribute to the overall objective. And as this coordination took shape, it reflected a broader shift in naval warfare, where information and timing became as important as firepower, and where the ability to act at the right moment could determine the outcome of an entire engagement. And on the other side, the Regia Marina continued its movement through the darkness with a focus on maintaining formation and readiness, unaware that the British fleet had already identified their position and was maneuvering into place. And this lack of awareness was not due to a failure of discipline or capability, but rather a consequence of the limitations imposed by the environment and the available technology. And as a result, the Italian ships moved forward with a sense of continuity, following their established course without the immediate need to react. And it is this contrast between awareness and unawareness that defines the critical nature of this moment, as it illustrates how the same environment can be experienced in fundamentally different ways depending on the tools and information available. And as the distance between the fleets narrowed further, the British ships prepared for the transition from detection to engagement, aligning their movements to ensure that when the moment came, it would be executed with precision and coordination. And this preparation was not hurried or chaotic, but deliberate and measured, reflecting a level of discipline that had been developed through training and experience. And as the final moments before contact unfolded, the darkness that had once concealed both fleets now became a stage upon which the encounter would be revealed. And within this space, the balance of power began to shift, not through visible action, but through the alignment of position, timing, and intent. And it is within this alignment that the true beginning of the battle can be understood, as it represents the point at which preparation gives way to action, and potential becomes reality. And as we move forward from this moment, the quiet tension of the approach will give way to a sudden and decisive engagement, one that will unfold with a speed and intensity that reflects the precision of the preparation that preceded it. And in this way, the first contact at Matapan serves as a reminder that the outcome of a battle is often shaped long before the first shot is fired, determined by the ability to see, to understand, and to act at the right moment within the vast and uncertain expanse of the sea. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The moment the night broke. The transition from silence to action did not announce itself with warning, but arrived suddenly, almost imperceptibly at first, as the carefully aligned movements of the Royal Navy reached the point where preparation could no longer remain separate from execution. And within the darkness of the Mediterranean, where only fragments of shape and motion could be seen with the naked eye, the final decision to engage unfolded not as a dramatic gesture, but as a sequence of deliberate actions carried out with precision. And in that moment, the advantage that had been built through awareness, positioning, and timing began to reveal itself as British ships, guided by radar and coordinated command, moved into positions that allowed them to act with clarity while their opponents remained uncertain. And this clarity was not merely a matter of knowing where the Italian ships were, but of understanding how to approach them in a way that maximized effectiveness while minimizing risk. And as the distance between the fleets narrowed to a critical threshold, the quiet rhythm of movement gave way to a heightened state of readiness, where every action carried immediate consequence, and within this narrow window, the first visible sign of the engagement emerged, not as an explosion, but as light sharp, sudden, and deliberate, cutting through the darkness in the form of searchlights, and these beams, directed with purpose, illuminated the silhouettes of the Regia Marina ships, transforming what had been hidden into clear and unmistakable targets. And in doing so, they altered the nature of the encounter in an instant, shifting it from uncertainty to exposure, and for the Italian crews, this sudden illumination marked the first true realization that they were no longer moving through an unseen environment, but were instead fully visible, their position revealed without warning, and this moment of realization was accompanied by the immediate need to respond. Yet the speed at which events unfolded left little time for adjustment, as the British ships, having prepared for this precise moment, began to act with coordinated intensity, and the opening fire that followed was not scattered or reactive, but focused and deliberate, each shot part of a broader sequence designed to overwhelm and disorient. And as the first rounds were fired, the calm of the Mediterranean night was replaced by a sudden and controlled eruption of sound and motion, where the stillness that had defined the approach was now broken by the coordinated force of naval engagement. And yet, even within this shift, there remained a sense of structure, as the actions of the British fleet reflected the discipline and planning that had guided them to this point, ensuring that the engagement unfolded according to a sequence that had been anticipated and prepared for. And it is within this transition from darkness to illumination, from silence to action, that the true beginning of the battle at Matapan can be understood, as it represents the moment where preparation became reality, and where the advantage gained through awareness was translated into decisive action, setting the stage for the rapid and consequential events that would follow. As the initial moments of engagement unfolded, the contrast between preparation and reaction became increasingly apparent, shaping the flow of the encounter in ways that would define its outcome. And for the Royal Navy, the transition from detection to engagement had been carefully structured, allowing each ship to act in coordination with the others, creating a unified response that maximized their effectiveness. And this coordination was evident not only in the timing of their actions, but in the way their movements complemented one another, ensuring that the engagement was not a series of isolated efforts, but a collective operation carried out with precision. And as the searchlights continued to illuminate their targets, the British ships maintained their advantage, using both visibility and positioning to control the direction and intensity of the encounter. And within this controlled environment, each action contributed to a broader sequence that had been designed to disrupt and overwhelm, and on the opposing side, the Regia Marina was forced to respond under conditions that were far less favorable, as the sudden exposure of their ships and the rapid onset of engagement created a situation in which coordination became more difficult to maintain. And while their crews acted with discipline and determination, the lack of prior awareness meant that their response was shaped by the immediate need to adapt, rather than by a pre-established plan. And this distinction between acting from preparation and reacting to unfolding events is central to understanding the dynamics of this moment, as it highlights the importance of timing and information in shaping the course of an engagement. And as the exchange of fire continued, the Mediterranean night, which had once concealed both fleets, now served as a backdrop to a rapidly intensifying encounter, where light and shadow interacted in a way that emphasized both the clarity of the British position and the challenges faced by the Italian ships. And within this interplay, the speed of events became a defining characteristic, as the engagement progressed with a pace that left little room for hesitation, and each moment carried forward into the next with a sense of inevitability, as the initial advantage gained by the British fleet continued to influence the unfolding situation, and as the ships moved, fired, and adjusted within this dynamic environment, the broader significance of the moment began to emerge. illustrating not only the effectiveness of the tactics employed, but the impact of technological and strategic evolution on the nature of naval warfare. And in this way, the opening phase of the battle at Matapan serves as a powerful example of how preparation, coordination, and the ability to act decisively can shape the outcome of an encounter, transforming a moment of contact into a rapidly unfolding sequence of events that would leave a lasting impression on the history of naval conflict. And as we move forward from this initial phase, it becomes clear that the engagement, though only just begun, had already been shaped by the factors that preceded it, setting the stage for the decisive actions that would follow in the moments ahead. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The destroyers closed the distance. As the opening moments of the engagement shattered the stillness of the Mediterranean night, the nature of the battle began to shift from sudden exposure to controlled aggression. And within this evolving dynamic, the role of the British destroyers became increasingly central, as these smaller, faster vessels moved with purpose through the darkness, closing the distance between themselves and the illuminated silhouettes of the Regia Marina ships. And this movement was not impulsive or chaotic, but part of a deliberate escalation in which proximity would amplify the effectiveness of their attack, allowing them to engage with greater precision and impact. And as they advanced, the coordination established earlier in the operation continued to guide their actions, ensuring that each movement contributed to the overall objective rather than disrupting it. And within this carefully managed approach, speed became a critical factor, as the destroyers used their agility to navigate the evolving battlefield, adjusting their course and position in response to both the unfolding situation and the predetermined plan. And this combination of speed and coordination created a sense of controlled momentum, as the British forces transitioned from the initial phase of detection and illumination into a more direct and sustained engagement. And for the crews aboard these destroyers, the experience of this moment would have been defined by a heightened awareness of both their surroundings and their role within the larger operation, as the darkness, though partially broken by searchlights and flashes of gunfire, still imposed limitations on visibility, requiring constant attention and adaptation. And yet, despite these challenges, the advantage of preparation remained evident, as the British ships continued to operate with a level of cohesion that reflected their earlier positioning and planning. And as they drew closer to their targets, the intensity of the encounter increased, not only in terms of action, but in the immediacy of decision-making, as the margin for error narrowed and each movement carried greater consequence. And it is within this narrowing space that the destroyers began to assert their presence more fully, transitioning from supporting elements of the engagement to active participants in its most decisive phase. And as their guns and torpedoes were brought into play, the character of the battle evolved further, becoming more dynamic and more concentrated, with each action contributing to a rapidly unfolding sequence of events. And on the opposing side, the Italian ships, now fully aware of the engagement, sought to respond within the constraints imposed by both the environment and the initial surprise. And while their crews worked to regain coordination and adapt to the situation, the speed and precision of the British approach made this increasingly difficult, as the destroyers' movements disrupted any attempt to establish a stable defensive response. And this disruption is a key aspect of the encounter, as it illustrates how the combination of timing, positioning, and coordinated action can influence not only the effectiveness of an attack, but the ability of the opposing force to respond. And as the distance between the ships continued to close, the engagement entered a phase where the outcome would be shaped not by long-range exchanges, but by the intensity of close-quarters naval combat. And it is within this phase that the actions of the destroyers would prove decisive, as their ability to operate effectively within this environment allowed them to translate the advantage gained in the opening moments into a sustained and impactful assault, setting the stage for the rapid and consequential developments that would follow. As the destroyers pressed further into the engagement, the battle took on a new level of immediacy, where distance, once a buffer between opposing forces, was now reduced to a narrow and rapidly changing space. And within this space, the actions of the Royal Navy became increasingly focused, as each ship operated not only as an individual unit, but as part of a coordinated system designed to maintain pressure and control over the unfolding situation. And this coordination was evident in the way the destroyers aligned their movements, ensuring that their approach created overlapping zones of engagement that limited the ability of the Regia Marina ships to maneuver effectively. And as this alignment took shape, it reinforced the advantage that had been established through earlier preparation, allowing the British forces to dictate the pace and direction of the encounter. And within this controlled environment, the use of torpedoes became a critical element of the destroyer's strategy, as these weapons allowed them to engage their targets with a level of impact that extended beyond the immediate reach of gunfire. And as torpedoes were launched into the darkness, guided by both calculation and experience, they introduced an additional layer of complexity to the battle, as their presence required the Italian ships to respond not only to visible threats, but to those that could not be seen until it was too late. And this dual nature of the engagement, where both visible and unseen elements played a role, further emphasized the advantage held by the British fleet, as their ability to coordinate these actions created a dynamic in which each component of their attack supported the others. And on the opposing side, the Italian crews faced the challenge of responding within an environment that had shifted rapidly from uncertainty to intensity, and while their training and discipline allowed them to act under pressure, the conditions of the engagement made it difficult to establish a cohesive response, as the overlapping actions of the British destroyers disrupted attempts to regain control. And this disruption is central to understanding the progression of the battle, as it illustrates how the combination of speed, coordination, and tactical execution can influence not only the effectiveness of an attack, but the ability of the opposing force to adapt. And as the engagement continued to unfold, the Mediterranean night, once a space of concealment, now served as a stage for a rapidly intensifying encounter, where flashes of light and movement revealed the shifting positions of the ships. And within this environment, the outcome of the battle began to take shape, not as a distant possibility, but as an emerging reality, shaped by the actions of those who had prepared for this moment and were now executing their plan with precision. And as the destroyers maintained their advance and continued their assault, it became clear that the engagement had entered a phase where the balance of power was no longer evenly contested, but increasingly influenced by the advantage that had been established in the opening moments. And it is within this phase that the decisive nature of the battle at Matapan becomes evident, as the combination of preparation, technology, and execution converges to create an outcome that would unfold with remarkable speed, transforming a moment of contact into a defining event in naval warfare. Chapter 2, Segment 3: The 28 Minutes That Changed the Battle. As the destroyers completed their approach and the distance between the opposing fleets narrowed to its most critical point, the engagement entered a phase defined not by gradual escalation, but by concentrated intensity, where the actions that had been building since the first moment of contact now converged into a sequence that would unfold with remarkable speed. And within this narrow window of time, the advantage held by the Royal Navy became fully apparent, as their coordinated movements, guided by prior awareness and precise timing, allowed them to act with a level of control that shaped the entire course of the encounter. And it is within this phase that the now often cited duration of just 28 minutes takes on its full meaning, not as a simple measure of time, but as a reflection of how quickly a well-prepared force can translate advantage into decisive action. And as the engagement intensified, the interplay between light and darkness became more pronounced, with searchlights and flashes of gunfire revealing brief glimpses of ships maneuvering within a confined and rapidly changing environment. And these moments of illumination, though fleeting, were enough to guide further action, allowing British ships to maintain their focus on specific targets while continuing to coordinate their movements with one another. And within this controlled intensity, the destroyers operated as both independent units and components of a larger system, their actions aligned in a way that ensured maximum effectiveness. And as they continued to engage, the cumulative impact of their efforts began to shape the outcome of the battle, as the Regia Marina ships, already affected by the initial surprise and the challenges of responding in darkness, found themselves increasingly constrained in their ability to maneuver and coordinate, and this constraint is a key aspect of the engagement, as it highlights how the disruption of movement and communication can influence the effectiveness of a fleet, limiting its capacity to respond even when its individual components remain operational. And as the minutes passed, each action contributed to a growing momentum, where the initial advantage of the British forces was reinforced by their continued ability to act in coordination, creating a dynamic in which the outcome of the engagement became increasingly difficult to alter. And yet, despite the intensity of this phase, there remained a sense of structure within the British approach, as their actions continued to reflect the planning and discipline that had guided them from the outset, ensuring that each movement and engagement was part of a broader sequence rather than a series of isolated actions. And this structured intensity is what defines the 28 minutes of the battle, as it illustrates how the combination of preparation, timing, and execution can create a moment where events unfold with both speed and clarity, shaping the outcome in a way that reflects not only the immediate actions of the participants, but the decisions and developments that preceded them. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the significance of these minutes lies not only in their brevity, but in the way they encapsulate the essence of the encounter, demonstrating how a carefully prepared force can act decisively when the conditions are right, transforming a moment of opportunity into a defining event. As the final moments of the engagement unfolded within that concentrated span of time, the cumulative effects of coordination, positioning, and sustained pressure began to manifest in ways that would define the lasting outcome of the encounter. And for the Royal Navy, the continuation of their structured approach ensured that the momentum gained in the opening stages was not only maintained, but reinforced, as each successive action built upon the previous one, creating a sequence that left little room for disruption or reversal. And within this sequence, the destroyers played a central role, their proximity to the Italian ships allowing them to operate with a level of precision and immediacy that amplified the overall effectiveness of the fleet. And as they continued to engage, their actions reflected both individual initiative and collective coordination, ensuring that the pressure applied to the Regia Marina remained consistent and focused. And on the opposing side, the Italian ships, though still active and attempting to respond, faced the compounded challenges of limited visibility, disrupted coordination, and the need to adapt to a rapidly evolving situation. And while their efforts demonstrated resilience and determination, the conditions under which they operated made it increasingly difficult to establish a cohesive response, as the pace and intensity of the British attack left little time for adjustment. And this imbalance between coordinated action and reactive response is central to understanding the outcome of the engagement, as it illustrates how the ability to act decisively within a structured framework can influence not only the immediate effectiveness of an attack, but the broader trajectory of a battle. And as the final minutes of the 28-minute period passed, the nature of the encounter began to shift once again, moving from active engagement toward the consolidation of its outcome, as the British forces, having achieved their immediate objectives, began to assess and adjust their position within the broader context of the operation. And this transition, though subtle, marked the conclusion of the most intense phase of the battle, as the rapid sequence of actions that had defined those minutes gave way to a moment of relative stabilization, where the results of the engagement could be understood and interpreted. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the significance of the 28 minutes lies not only in their duration, but in their impact, as they demonstrate how the convergence of preparation, technology, and execution can shape the course of an encounter in a way that is both decisive and enduring. And in doing so, they highlight the evolving nature of naval warfare, where the ability to control the moment of engagement can be as important as the strength of the forces involved, and where the outcome of a battle can be determined within a span of time that, while brief, carries consequences that extend far beyond it, marking the events at Matapan as a defining example of how precision and timing can transform the dynamics of conflict, leaving a lasting imprint on both the history of the war and the understanding of how such engagements are conducted. Chapter 3, Segment 1: How 3 Destroyers Gained Control. In the immediate aftermath of those decisive 28 minutes, the question that emerges is not simply what happened, but how it was possible for a relatively small group of ships to exert such overwhelming influence over a larger force. And to answer this, it is necessary to move beyond the visible actions of the battle and examine the underlying structure that made those actions effective, because the outcome at the Battle of Cape Matapan was not determined by numbers alone, but by the interaction of timing, coordination, and the ability to operate within a framework that maximized each advantage. And at the center of this framework was the Royal Navy, whose approach to the engagement reflected a broader shift in naval doctrine, one that emphasized the integration of information and action in a way that allowed even smaller units, such as destroyers, to play a decisive role when properly positioned and coordinated, and these destroyers, often perceived as supporting elements within a larger fleet, demonstrated at Matapan that their effectiveness was not limited by their size, but enhanced by their speed, maneuverability, and ability to operate within close proximity to the target. And as they moved through the darkness during the engagement, their actions were guided not by improvisation, but by a clear understanding of their role within the broader operation, allowing them to act with a level of precision that amplified their impact, and this precision was made possible in part by the information advantage provided through radar, which allowed British forces to detect and track the movements of the Regia Marina ships without relying solely on visual confirmation, and this capability transformed the nature of the engagement, as it enabled the British fleet to position itself in a way that maximized the effectiveness of its destroyers while limiting the ability of the Italian ships to respond, and as a result, the destroyers were able to close the distance under conditions that favored their approach, using the darkness not as a limitation, but as a tool that, when combined with their technological advantage, allowed them to operate with both stealth and precision. And within this environment, the concept of control becomes central, not as a matter of dominance through force alone, but as the ability to shape the conditions of the engagement in a way that restricts the options available to the opposing force, and this control was evident in the way the British destroyers coordinated their movements, ensuring that their actions were aligned with one another and with the broader objectives of the fleet, creating a dynamic in which each ship contributed to a unified effort. And as this dynamic unfolded, it revealed the importance of preparation and training, as the ability to execute such coordinated actions in a complex and rapidly changing environment required a level of discipline and familiarity that could only be achieved through sustained practice and experience. And it is this combination of preparation, information, and execution that explains how 3 destroyers were able to exert such a significant influence over the engagement, demonstrating that in modern naval warfare, the effectiveness of a force is determined not only by its size, but by its ability to operate as a cohesive and adaptable system. And as we consider this aspect of the battle, it becomes clear that the events at Matapan represent more than a moment of tactical success, but a reflection of a broader transformation in the way naval engagements were conducted, where the integration of technology and coordination allowed smaller units to achieve outcomes that would have been far more difficult under traditional methods. And in this way, the actions of the destroyers serve as a powerful example of how innovation and execution can redefine the balance of power within a given encounter. Building upon this understanding, it becomes evident that the success of the destroyers at Matapan was not the result of a single factor, but the convergence of multiple elements that together created a situation in which their strengths could be fully realized. And among these elements, the concept of initiative plays a crucial role, as the Royal Navy was able to seize and maintain control of the engagement from its earliest moments, ensuring that its actions were guided by choice rather than necessity. And this ability to act on one's own terms is a defining characteristic of effective strategy, as it allows a force to shape the course of events rather than simply respond to them. And in the case of the destroyers, this initiative was reflected in their willingness to close the distance and engage at a range where their capabilities could be most effectively employed. And while such an approach carried inherent risks, these risks were mitigated by the preparation and coordination that had been established beforehand, allowing the destroyers to operate with confidence even in a complex and dynamic environment. And at the same time, The challenges faced by the Regia Marina highlight the importance of situational awareness in maintaining effective control during an engagement, as the lack of early detection limited their ability to anticipate and respond to the British approach, creating a situation in which their actions were shaped by the need to adapt rather than the opportunity to plan. And this distinction between proactive and reactive behavior is central to understanding the outcome of the battle, as it illustrates how the initial conditions of an engagement can influence its progression in ways that extend far beyond the first moments of contact. And as the destroyers continued their operations within this framework, their actions demonstrated the value of flexibility, as their ability to adjust their movements and tactics in response to changing conditions allowed them to maintain their effectiveness even as the engagement evolved, and this flexibility, combined with their speed and maneuverability, enabled them to exploit opportunities as they arose, ensuring that the advantage gained through initial preparation was not only preserved, but expanded, and within this context, the role of coordination becomes even more significant, as it was through the alignment of individual actions within a broader strategy that the destroyers were able to achieve a level of effectiveness that exceeded what might be expected from their numbers alone. And this alignment reflects a deeper understanding of how complex systems operate, where the interaction between components can create outcomes that are greater than the sum of their parts. And as we reflect on the events at Matapan, it becomes clear that the actions of the destroyers represent a convergence of these principles, illustrating how initiative, awareness, flexibility, and coordination can come together to create a decisive advantage, and in doing so, they provide a lasting example of how the nature of naval warfare was evolving during this period, moving toward an approach that emphasized the integration of technology and strategy in a way that allowed even smaller units to play a pivotal role in shaping the outcome of an engagement. And it is through this lens that the success of the destroyers can be fully understood, not as an isolated occurrence, but as a reflection of the broader changes that were redefining the way naval battles were fought and won. Chapter 3, Segment 2. The Italian Fleet Under Pressure. As the intensity of the engagement at the Battle of Cape Matapan continued to unfold, the situation faced by the Regia Marina began to shift from one of active engagement to one increasingly defined by pressure and constraint. And this transition was not the result of a single decisive moment, but rather the cumulative effect of the conditions under which the battle had begun, conditions that had placed the Italian fleet at a disadvantage from the outset, particularly in terms of situational awareness and the ability to coordinate effectively in the darkness. And as the engagement progressed, these initial disadvantages began to manifest more clearly, influencing not only the actions of individual ships, but the overall cohesion of the fleet. And within this environment, the ability to maintain a clear and consistent understanding of the situation became increasingly difficult, as the interplay of darkness, sudden illumination, and rapid movement created a dynamic in which information was both limited and constantly changing, and for the Italian crews, this meant operating within a framework where decisions had to be made quickly, often based on incomplete or rapidly evolving information. And while their training and discipline provided a foundation for responding to such challenges, the nature of the engagement placed significant strain on their ability to coordinate effectively across the fleet, and as a result, the structured formations that had characterized their earlier movements began to lose their coherence, as the need to respond to immediate threats took precedence over maintaining alignment with the broader formation. And this shift in focus is a key aspect of understanding the pressure faced by the Italian fleet, as it illustrates how the conditions of an engagement can force a transition from coordinated action to localized response. And while such a transition can be necessary in certain situations, it also introduces a level of fragmentation that can reduce the overall effectiveness of the force. And as the British destroyers continued to operate with a high degree of coordination and precision, their actions further contributed to this fragmentation, as their movements and engagements disrupted any attempts by the Italian ships to reestablish a cohesive formation. And within this evolving environment, the concept of control becomes increasingly important, not only in terms of the ability to direct one's own actions, but in the ability to limit the options available to the opposing force. And in this regard, the British fleet, particularly the Royal Navy destroyers, were able to maintain a level of control that influenced the direction and pace of the engagement, creating a situation in which the Italian fleet was forced to operate within a framework that was largely defined by the actions of their opponents. And as this dynamic continued to develop, the pressure on the Italian ships intensified, not only in terms of the immediate demands of the engagement, but in the broader challenge of maintaining coordination and effectiveness under increasingly difficult conditions. And it is within this context that the experience of the Italian fleet during this phase of the battle can be understood, not simply as a matter of facing an effective opponent, but as navigating a situation in which the balance of information, coordination, and control had shifted in a way that made it progressively more difficult to respond effectively. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the pressure faced by the Italian fleet was both immediate and cumulative, shaped by the conditions of the engagement and the actions of their opponents, and that this pressure would play a central role in shaping the outcome of the battle as it continued to unfold. As the engagement moved further into this phase of sustained pressure, the effects of fragmentation within the Regia Marina became more pronounced, influencing not only the coordination of the fleet, but also the ability of individual ships to operate within a clear and consistent framework. And this increasing fragmentation can be understood as the point at which the cumulative challenges of the engagement began to outweigh the structures that had previously supported effective coordination, creating a situation in which the actions of the fleet were shaped more by immediate necessity than by cohesive strategy. And within this environment, the interplay between visibility and uncertainty continued to play a significant role, as the darkness, combined with the intermittent illumination provided by searchlights and flashes of gunfire, created a visual landscape that was both revealing and disorienting, allowing certain elements of the situation to be seen with clarity while leaving others obscured, and this uneven distribution of information contributed to the difficulty of maintaining a unified response, as different parts of the fleet operated with varying levels of awareness, making it more challenging to coordinate actions across the entire formation. And at the same time, the continued actions of the Royal Navy reinforced this imbalance, as their coordinated approach ensured that their own awareness and alignment remained consistent, allowing them to maintain pressure while adapting to the evolving conditions of the engagement. And this contrast between coordinated action and fragmented response is central to understanding the dynamics of this phase, as it highlights how the ability to maintain cohesion under pressure can influence not only the immediate effectiveness of a force, but its capacity to adapt and respond over time. And as the Italian ships continued to operate within this increasingly complex environment, their efforts to regain coordination and respond effectively were shaped by both their training and the limitations imposed by the situation. And while these efforts demonstrated resilience, the conditions of the engagement made it increasingly difficult to achieve a level of alignment that could counter the coordinated actions of the British fleet. And as a result, the balance of the engagement continued to shift, with the Italian fleet finding itself in a position where each action was influenced by the need to respond to an opponent that retained both the initiative and the advantage of coordination. And within this context, the concept of momentum becomes particularly relevant, as the initial advantage gained by the British forces was not only maintained, but reinforced through their continued ability to act in a coordinated and deliberate manner, creating a dynamic in which the direction of the engagement became increasingly defined by their actions. And as this momentum continued to build, it further limited the ability of the Italian fleet to alter the course of the battle, illustrating how the interplay of pressure, fragmentation, and coordination can shape the progression of an engagement in a way that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the experience of the Italian fleet at Matapan was defined not only by the immediate challenges of the encounter, but by the broader dynamics that influenced their ability to respond, highlighting the importance of awareness, coordination, and control in determining the outcome of naval engagements, and providing a deeper understanding of how the conditions of a battle can evolve over time, shaping both the actions of those involved and the ultimate result of the encounter. Chapter 3, Segment 3: The Collapse and Aftermath. As the final phase of the engagement at the Battle of Cape Matapan unfolded, the cumulative effects of pressure, fragmentation, and loss of initiative within the Regia Marina reached a point where the structure of the fleet could no longer be maintained in any meaningful sense, and what had once been a coordinated force operating under a unified command gradually transitioned into a collection of individual ships, each attempting to navigate an increasingly complex and constrained environment. And this transition was not marked by a single decisive moment, but rather by a series of interconnected developments that, taken together, signaled the erosion of cohesion that is essential for effective naval operations. And within this environment, the ability to communicate clearly and consistently became increasingly limited, as the conditions of the engagement, combined with the disruption caused by the actions of the opposing force, made it more difficult to maintain the flow of information that underpins coordinated action, and as a result, the decisions made by individual commanders were increasingly shaped by their immediate circumstances rather than by a broader strategic framework. And while such decisions could be effective in addressing local challenges, they also contributed to the overall fragmentation of the fleet, as the absence of a unified approach made it more difficult to align individual actions with collective objectives. And at the same time, the continued coordination of the Royal Navy ensured that their actions remained consistent and mutually reinforcing, allowing them to maintain control over the direction and pace of the engagement. And this contrast between cohesion and fragmentation is central to understanding the collapse of the Italian fleet during this phase, as it illustrates how the ability to operate as a unified system can influence not only the effectiveness of individual actions, but the overall resilience of a force. Under pressure, and as the engagement continued, the limitations faced by the Italian ships became more pronounced, as their ability to maneuver, communicate, and respond effectively was increasingly constrained by both the conditions of the battle and the actions of their opponents. And within this context, the concept of inevitability begins to emerge, not as a predetermined outcome, but as the result of a series of developments that progressively reduced the range of viable options available to the Italian fleet. And as these options diminished, the ability to alter the course of the engagement became increasingly limited, creating a situation in which the outcome was shaped less by isolated decisions and more by the broader dynamics that had been established earlier in the battle. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the collapse of the Italian fleet was not simply the result of being outmatched in a conventional sense, but the culmination of a process in which the balance of information, coordination, and control had shifted in a way that made effective response increasingly difficult. And it is through this lens that the events of this phase can be understood, as a demonstration of how the interplay of these factors can influence the progression of an engagement in a way that leads to a gradual but decisive breakdown of cohesion, and ultimately, to the loss of the ability to operate as an effective fighting force. In the aftermath of this collapse, the engagement at the Battle of Cape Matapan transitioned from a dynamic and contested encounter into a situation defined by its consequences. And these consequences extended beyond the immediate results of the battle to influence the broader context in which it occurred, and for the Regia Marina, the outcome represented not only a loss in terms of ships and operational capability, but a moment that highlighted the challenges of adapting to a rapidly evolving form of naval warfare, where the integration of technology, coordination, and strategy had become increasingly important. And as the events of the battle were analyzed in the days and weeks that followed, it became clear that the factors that had shaped the engagement were not unique to this particular encounter, but indicative of broader changes that were influencing naval operations across multiple theaters. And in this sense, the battle can be understood as both a specific event and a reflection of a wider transformation, one in which the ability to gather, interpret, and act upon information played a central role in determining outcomes. And for the Royal Navy, the engagement demonstrated the effectiveness of an approach that emphasized coordination and the integration of new technologies, such as radar, into operational planning, allowing them to achieve a level of awareness and control that provided a significant advantage. And this advantage was not limited to the immediate context of the battle, but contributed to a broader understanding of how naval engagements could be conducted in a way that maximized the effectiveness of available resources. And as this understanding continued to develop, it influenced the way in which future operations were planned and executed, reinforcing the importance of maintaining cohesion and adaptability in the face of changing conditions. And at the same time, the experience of the Italian fleet underscored the challenges of operating within an environment where these factors were not fully aligned, highlighting the importance of developing systems and practices that could support effective coordination and situational awareness even under difficult conditions. And as we reflect on the aftermath of the battle, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in the immediate results, but in the insights it provides into the nature of naval warfare during this period, illustrating how the interplay of technology, coordination, and strategy can shape the outcome of an engagement in ways that extend beyond the actions of individual ships or commanders. And in this way, the events at Matapan serve as a powerful example of how the evolution of warfare is driven by the interaction of these elements, and how the ability to adapt to this evolution can determine success or failure. And as the final echoes of the engagement faded, what remained was not only the memory of what had occurred, but a deeper understanding of how such events come to pass, and of the factors that must be considered in order to navigate the complexities of modern naval operations. And it is this understanding that forms the lasting legacy of the battle, providing a framework through which its events can be interpreted and its significance fully appreciated. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The Strategic Shock Across the Mediterranean. In the quiet hours that followed the conclusion of the Battle of Cape Matapan, the surface of the Mediterranean gradually returned to a deceptive calm, but beneath that calm, the consequences of what had just taken place began to ripple outward in ways that extended far beyond the immediate destruction of ships and the conclusion of a single engagement. And for the Regia Marina, the battle represented not only a tactical defeat, but a profound strategic shock, one that challenged long-held assumptions about their ability to operate effectively within the contested waters of the Mediterranean. And as reports of the engagement began to reach command structures and naval headquarters, the realization set in that the balance of power at sea had shifted in a manner that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. And this realization was shaped not only by the scale of the losses incurred, but by the manner in which those losses had occurred, as the effectiveness of the British approach highlighted vulnerabilities that had previously been underestimated or overlooked, particularly in the areas of night operations, coordination, and the integration of new technologies. And within this context, the concept of strategic confidence becomes central, as the ability of a naval force to project power and influence is closely tied to its belief in its own capabilities. And at Matapan, that confidence had been significantly undermined, creating a situation in which future operations would be approached with a heightened sense of caution. And this shift in mindset is an important aspect of understanding the broader impact of the battle, as it illustrates how the outcome of a single engagement can influence not only immediate actions, but the longer-term approach to strategy and planning. And as the Italian Naval Command began to assess the implications of the defeat, the need to reconsider operational practices became increasingly apparent, particularly in relation to the challenges posed by an opponent that demonstrated a clear advantage in coordination and situational awareness. And at the same time, the Royal Navy emerged from the engagement with a reinforced sense of confidence in their methods and capabilities, as the success achieved at Matapan provided tangible evidence of the effectiveness of their approach, particularly in the integration of radar and coordinated fleet movements, and this confidence would play a significant role in shaping subsequent operations, as it allowed British forces to act with a level of assurance that further reinforced their ability to maintain control within contested environments. And as these developments unfolded, the Mediterranean itself became a stage upon which the implications of the battle would continue to be played out, as both sides adjusted their strategies in response to the lessons learned. And within this evolving context, the significance of Matapan can be understood not only in terms of what occurred during the engagement, but in terms of how it reshaped the strategic landscape in which future operations would take place, influencing decisions, shaping expectations, and altering the balance of power in ways that would continue to resonate throughout the course of the war. and it is through this lens that the true impact of the battle begins to emerge, revealing a moment that extended far beyond the immediate encounter and into the broader dynamics of the conflict itself. As the broader implications of the Battle of Cape Matapan continued to unfold, the strategic shock experienced by the Regia Marina began to influence not only their immediate operational decisions, but the fundamental way in which they approached the challenges of naval warfare within the Mediterranean, and this influence can be seen in the increasing emphasis placed on caution and the avoidance of engagements under conditions that were perceived to favor the opponent, particularly during nighttime operations where the advantages demonstrated by the British had been most apparent. And while such caution can serve as a means of preserving resources and minimizing risk, it also carries with it the potential to limit initiative, creating a dynamic in which opportunities for action are constrained by the desire to avoid unfavorable conditions, and this dynamic is central to understanding the longer-term impact of the battle, as it illustrates how the psychological effects of a defeat can shape strategic behavior in ways that extend beyond the immediate circumstances, and at the same time, the Royal Navy continued to build upon the confidence gained from their success, refining their approach and further integrating the technologies and practices that had proven effective. And this process of refinement is an important aspect of how strategic advantages are sustained over time, as it ensures that initial successes are not only maintained, but expanded upon through continuous adaptation and improvement. And within this context, the role of technology becomes particularly significant, as the effective use of radar during the engagement had demonstrated its potential to transform the way naval operations were conducted, providing a level of awareness that could be leveraged to achieve both tactical and strategic advantages. And as this potential became more widely recognized, it influenced the development of naval doctrine and the allocation of resources, reinforcing the importance of integrating technological advancements into operational planning. And as both sides adjusted to these evolving conditions, the Mediterranean theater itself began to reflect the changes brought about by the battle, with shifts in operational patterns and strategic priorities that were directly influenced by the lessons learned at Matapan. And these shifts highlight the interconnected nature of military engagements, where the outcome of a single battle can influence a wide range of subsequent actions, shaping the trajectory of the conflict in ways that may not be immediately apparent. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the strategic shock of Matapan was not a momentary effect, but a catalyst for a broader process of adaptation and change, one that would continue to influence the conduct of naval operations throughout the war. And in this sense, the battle serves as a powerful example of how the consequences of an engagement can extend far beyond its immediate context, shaping not only the actions of those directly involved, but the broader dynamics of the conflict as a whole, and providing valuable insights into the ways in which strategy, technology, and psychology interact to influence the course of events in complex and evolving environments. Chapter 4, Segment 2: How Matapan Changed Naval Warfare. In the months that followed the Battle of Cape Matapan, its significance began to extend beyond the immediate strategic shock and into a deeper transformation of how naval warfare itself was understood and conducted. And this transformation was not confined to a single navy or a single theater, but reflected a broader shift in thinking that was taking place across multiple forces engaged in the conflict, as commanders and planners sought to interpret the lessons of the battle and integrate them into future operations. And at the center of this shift was a growing recognition that the traditional assumptions which had governed naval engagements, particularly those based on visibility, formation, and the predictable sequence of daylight encounters, were no longer sufficient to account for the realities of a rapidly evolving technological and operational environment. And within this context, the role of information began to take on a new level of importance, as the ability to detect, interpret, and act upon data became a defining factor in determining success or failure, and it was here that the approach demonstrated by the Royal Navy during the battle provided a clear example of how these capabilities could be effectively integrated, particularly through the use of radar, which allowed for a level of situational awareness that extended beyond the limitations of human sight. And this capability fundamentally altered the nature of naval engagements, as it enabled forces to operate with a degree of precision and coordination that had previously been difficult to achieve, especially under conditions of darkness or reduced visibility, and as a result, the concept of night operations began to be reevaluated, shifting from a period traditionally associated with caution and limited activity to one in which decisive action could be taken by those who possessed the necessary technological and organizational advantages. And this reevaluation had far-reaching implications, as it required changes not only in equipment and training, but in the broader mindset with which naval forces approached the conduct of operations. And for the Regia Marina, the lessons of Matapan underscored the importance of addressing the gaps that had been revealed, particularly in terms of coordination and the ability to operate effectively under conditions where traditional visual cues were insufficient. And while efforts were made to adapt to these challenges, the process of integrating new technologies and practices into an established framework proved to be complex, highlighting the difficulties inherent in transitioning from one mode of operation to another, and at the same time, the success of the British approach reinforced the value of a system in which technology, training, and doctrine were aligned, allowing for a level of cohesion that amplified the effectiveness of individual components. And as this alignment became more widely recognized, it influenced the development of naval strategies across multiple forces, contributing to a broader evolution in the way maritime engagements were conceived and executed. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the impact of Matapan on naval warfare was not limited to the specific tactics employed during the battle, but extended into the fundamental principles that guided the conduct of operations, illustrating how a single engagement can serve as a catalyst for change in a complex and interconnected system, and providing a lens through which the ongoing evolution of warfare can be understood. As the influence of the Battle of Cape Matapan continued to shape naval thinking, its effects became increasingly evident in the way future operations were planned and executed, particularly in the emphasis placed on coordination and the integration of multiple elements into a cohesive operational framework. And this emphasis reflects a broader understanding that the effectiveness of a naval force is determined not only by the capabilities of its individual ships, but by the way in which those capabilities are combined and directed toward a common objective. And within this framework, the concept of networked action begins to emerge, where the flow of information between units allows for a level of synchronization that enhances the overall effectiveness of the force. And this concept, while still in its early stages during the period in question, represents a significant departure from earlier approaches that relied more heavily on rigid formations and predefined sequences of action. And as navies sought to adapt to this new reality, the importance of flexibility became increasingly apparent, as the ability to adjust to changing conditions and exploit emerging opportunities was recognized as a key factor in maintaining an advantage. And for the Royal Navy, the experience of Matapan provided a foundation upon which these principles could be further ifkisat, allowing them to refine their approach and continue to build upon the advantages that had been demonstrated during the engagement. And this process of refinement was supported by ongoing developments in technology, including improvements in radar and communication systems, which further enhanced their ability to operate effectively in complex and dynamic environments. And at the same time, the challenges faced by the Regia Marina highlight the importance of adaptability in responding to such changes, as the process of integrating new technologies and practices requires not only technical adjustments, but a willingness to reconsider established methods and assumptions, and this process can be both demanding and time-consuming, particularly in the context of an ongoing conflict where the pressures of immediate operations must be balanced with the need for longer-term development. And as these dynamics continued to play out, the broader impact of Matapan became increasingly clear, as it contributed to a shift in the way naval warfare was understood, emphasizing the importance of information, coordination, and adaptability as key determinants of success. And this shift would continue to influence the conduct of naval operations throughout the remainder of the war and beyond, shaping the development of doctrines and practices that reflected the evolving nature of maritime conflict. And as we reflect on this transformation, it becomes evident that the significance of the battle lies not only in its immediate outcome, but in its role as a catalyst for change, illustrating how the lessons of a single engagement can extend far beyond its immediate context, influencing the trajectory of an entire domain of warfare and providing valuable insights into the complex interplay of factors that determine success in an ever-changing operational environment. Chapter 4, Segment 3, Survivors, Memory and Legacy. In the stillness that followed the violence of the Battle of Cape Matapan, the focus gradually shifted away from the movement of ships and the coordination of fleets towards something far more personal and enduring, the experience of those who had lived through the engagement. And in this transition, the scale of the battle begins to be understood not only in terms of strategy and outcome, but in terms of the individuals whose lives were shaped by it. And for the sailors of the Regia Marina, the aftermath was marked by a profound sense of disorientation, as the structured environment of naval operations gave way to the uncertainty of survival in open water, where the familiar rhythms of duty and command were replaced by the immediate and pressing need to endure. And within this environment, time itself seemed to change, stretching and compressing in ways that made it difficult to distinguish between moments, as the darkness that had defined the battle lingered, and the vastness of the sea created a sense of isolation that was both physical and psychological. And for those who found themselves in the water, the experience was shaped not only by the conditions around them, but by the memories of what had just occurred, as the sounds and sights of the engagement continued to echo in their minds, blending with the present in a way that made it difficult to separate the past from the immediate reality. And at the same time, the response of the Royal Navy introduced another dimension to the aftermath, as efforts were made to locate and assist survivors, reflecting a recognition that even within the context of conflict, there remained an obligation to preserve life where possible, and these efforts, carried out under conditions that were still uncertain and potentially hazardous, required a careful balance between operational considerations and humanitarian concerns, illustrating the complexity of decision-making in the aftermath of an engagement. And as survivors were brought aboard and the immediate danger began to recede, the process of understanding what had occurred began to take shape, not as a single, unified narrative, but as a collection of individual experiences, each shaped by the specific circumstances in which they had taken place. And it is through these experiences that the human dimension of the battle becomes most apparent, revealing a perspective that complements the broader strategic and operational analysis. And as these stories were later recounted, they contributed to a deeper understanding of the engagement, highlighting the ways in which large-scale events are experienced on an individual level, and how those experiences can influence the way in which the event is remembered and interpreted. And in this sense, the aftermath of the battle represents not only a period of recovery and reflection, but the beginning of a process through which the events of Matapan would be integrated into a broader historical narrative. 1. That encompasses both the actions of fleets and the experiences of the individuals who were part of them. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the legacy of the battle is not limited to its immediate outcomes, but extends into the realm of memory and interpretation, where the meaning of the event continues to evolve over time, shaped by the perspectives of those who experienced it and those who study it. And it is within this evolving context that the true significance of the battle begins to emerge, revealing a moment that is both specific in its details and expansive in its implications. As time moved forward and the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Cape Matapan gave way to longer-term reflection, the process of memory and interpretation began to take on a more structured form, as accounts of the engagement were recorded, analyzed, and incorporated into the broader history of the conflict. And within this process, the perspectives of both the Regia Marina and the Royal Navy contributed to a multifaceted understanding of the battle, one that reflects the complexity of the event and the diversity of experiences that it encompassed. And for those who had been directly involved, the act of recounting the events of the battle served not only as a means of preserving information, but as a way of making sense of an experience that had been both intense and disorienting. And through these accounts, certain themes began to emerge, including the importance of coordination, the impact of technological innovation, and the challenges of operating under conditions of uncertainty. And these themes, while rooted in the specific context of Matapan, also resonate more broadly, providing insights into the nature of naval warfare during this period and the factors that influence the outcome of engagements. And as historians and analysts examine these accounts, they sought to identify patterns and draw conclusions that could inform future operations, contributing to the development of doctrines and practices that reflected the lessons learned from the battle. And, in this way, the legacy of Matapan extends beyond its immediate historical context, influencing the way in which naval warfare is understood and studied, and at the same time, the human dimension of the battle continues to play a central role in shaping its legacy, as the stories of those who experienced the engagement provide a connection to the past that goes beyond abstract analysis, offering a perspective that is both personal and relatable. And it is through this combination of analysis and narrative that the full significance of the battle can be appreciated, as it highlights the interplay between large-scale events and individual experiences, and the ways in which each informs the other. And as the memory of the battle has been preserved and passed down through generations, it has become part of a broader historical consciousness, one that encompasses not only the specific details of the engagement, but the wider context in which it occurred and the lessons that can be drawn from it. And as we reflect on this legacy, it becomes clear that the true impact of the battle lies not only in what happened during those 28 minutes, but in the ways in which those events have been remembered, interpreted, and integrated into a larger understanding of history, providing a lasting reminder of the complexity and significance of the past, and the importance of examining it from multiple perspectives in order to gain a more complete and nuanced understanding of its meaning. Chapter 5, Segment 1, The Wider War at Sea. In the days and weeks following the Battle of Cape Matapan, the Mediterranean did not remain still for long, and while the echoes of that decisive engagement continued to shape the thinking of naval commanders, the broader conflict pressed forward with a constant and unrelenting momentum, drawing ships, crews, and entire fleets back into a cycle of movement, supply, and confrontation. And within this wider context, the significance of Matapan begins to take on a different dimension, not only as a moment of tactical and strategic importance, but as a turning point within an ongoing struggle for control over vital sea routes. And these routes, stretching across the Mediterranean, were essential not only for military operations, but for the flow of supplies, fuel, and reinforcements that sustained the war effort on multiple fronts. And for the Royal Navy, maintaining control over these routes was a priority of the highest order, as it allowed them to support operations in North Africa and beyond, while also limiting the ability of their opponents to do the same. And the outcome at Matapan reinforced their position, providing both a practical advantage in terms of reduced opposition and a psychological boost that strengthened their resolve to continue asserting control over the region. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of adapting to a new reality, one in which their ability to operate freely within the Mediterranean had been significantly constrained. And this constraint was not absolute, as they retained the capacity to conduct operations and support their forces, but it required a more cautious and calculated approach, one that balanced the need to act with the necessity of avoiding situations that could lead to further losses. And as a result, the rhythm of naval operations began to shift, with an increased emphasis on protecting convoys, avoiding unnecessary exposure, and coordinating closely with other elements of the broader war effort, including air support and coastal defenses. And within this evolving environment, the concept of control becomes increasingly complex, as it is no longer defined solely by the presence or absence of ships in a given area, but by the ability to influence the movement of resources and the timing of operations. And in this regard, the British were able to leverage their advantage to shape the conditions under which engagements occurred, choosing when and where to apply pressure in a way that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing risk. And as this dynamic continued to develop, it highlighted the interconnected nature of naval warfare, where individual engagements are part of a larger system that includes logistics, intelligence, and coordination across multiple domains. And it is within this system that the true impact of Matapan can be understood, as it contributed to a shift in the balance of power that influenced not only immediate operations, but the broader trajectory of the conflict in the Mediterranean. And as ships once again moved across the sea, carrying supplies, personnel, and the weight of strategic objectives, they did so within a landscape that had been subtly but significantly altered by the events of that night. A landscape in which the lessons of Matapan continued to inform decisions, shape expectations, and influence the course of the war at sea. As the Mediterranean theater continued to evolve in the wake of the Battle of Cape Matapan, the interplay between naval operations and the broader war effort became increasingly pronounced, revealing the extent to which control of the sea was intertwined with developments on land and in the air. And within this interconnected environment, the role of naval forces extended beyond direct engagements to include the protection of supply lines, the support of ground operations, and the projection of influence across vast distances. And for the Royal Navy, the confidence gained from their success at Matapan translated into a more assertive approach to these responsibilities, allowing them to operate with a sense of purpose that reinforced their ability to maintain control over key areas. And this assertiveness was reflected not only in their willingness to engage when conditions were favorable, but in their broader strategy of maintaining a consistent presence that limited the freedom of movement of their opponents. And at the same time, the Regia Marina found itself navigating a more constrained operational environment, where the need to protect critical supply routes to North Africa required careful planning and coordination, particularly in light of the increased risk associated with open engagements. And this necessity led to a greater reliance on coordinated operations that involved multiple branches of the military, including air forces and coastal defenses, in an effort to mitigate the disadvantages that had been highlighted by the battle. And as these efforts were implemented, they demonstrated both the resilience of the Italian forces and the challenges inherent in adapting to a shifting strategic landscape. And within this context, the concept of balance becomes central, as both sides sought to manage the competing demands of offense and defense, risk and opportunity, and immediate needs versus long-term objectives. And it is through this process of balancing that the broader dynamics of the Mediterranean War can be understood, as a continuous negotiation between competing priorities and constraints, shaped by the outcomes of previous engagements and the anticipation of future ones. And as the months progressed, the influence of Matapan remained evident in the decisions made by both sides, serving as a reference point for what could be achieved under certain conditions and a reminder of the risks associated with misjudging those conditions. And in this way, the battle continued to exert an influence that extended far beyond its immediate context, shaping the conduct of naval operations and contributing to the evolving narrative of the war in the Mediterranean. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the significance of Matapan lies not only in its direct outcomes, but in its role as a catalyst for change within a complex and interconnected system, one that encompasses not only ships and fleets, but the broader network of factors that define the conduct of war at sea. And it is through this lens that the events of this period can be fully appreciated, as part of a larger story in which each engagement contributes to the ongoing process of adaptation, learning, and strategic evolution that defines the course of conflict. Chapter 5, Segment 2: Convoys, Supply Lines, and Constant Tension. In the vast and contested expanse of the Mediterranean, far from the dramatic flashes of major naval engagements like the Battle of Cape Matapan, another kind of struggle unfolded day after day, one that was quieter, more persistent, and no less decisive in shaping the course of the war. And this was the struggle of convoys, of ships moving steadily across open water, carrying with them not only cargo, but the essential lifeblood of entire campaigns. And within this system of movement, the significance of each vessel extended far beyond its physical presence, as it represented a link in a chain that connected distant ports, supply depots, and front lines. And for the Royal Navy, the protection of these convoys became a central priority, requiring a level of coordination and vigilance that matched, and in some ways exceeded, that of major fleet engagements, because unlike a single battle, the convoy system was continuous, unfolding over days and weeks, and requiring sustained attention in order to ensure its success. And as ships departed from their points of origin, they entered an environment defined by uncertainty, where the threat of interception was ever present, and where the ability to detect and respond to potential dangers was critical. And within this environment, the lessons of Matapan continued to influence operational thinking, particularly in the emphasis placed on maintaining situational awareness and coordinating movements in a way that maximized the effectiveness of available resources, and this emphasis was reflected in the way escorting vessels were deployed, positioned to provide both protection and early warning, creating a layered defense that sought to anticipate and counter potential threats before they could fully develop. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of disrupting these convoys while also ensuring the safe passage of their own supply lines, particularly those supporting operations in North Africa. And this dual responsibility required a careful balancing of resources and priorities, as each action taken to intercept an enemy convoy carried with it the risk of exposure and potential counteraction. And within this context, the Mediterranean became a space defined not by isolated engagements, but by a continuous interplay of movement and counter-movement, where the presence of ships was both a necessity and a vulnerability. And as convoys moved across the space, their progress was shaped by a combination of planning, coordination, and adaptation, as commanders sought to navigate the complexities of the environment while maintaining the flow of supplies that was essential to the broader war effort. And it is within this ongoing process that the true significance of convoy operations becomes apparent, as they represent a form of warfare that is both strategic and operational, influencing the course of events not through a single decisive moment, but through the cumulative effect of sustained effort over time. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the Mediterranean was not only a battlefield, but a network of routes and connections, where the success or failure of convoys could have far-reaching consequences, shaping the availability of resources, the timing of operations, and the overall trajectory of the conflict. As the rhythm of convoy operations continued to define much of the activity within the Mediterranean, the environment in which these movements took place remained one of constant tension, where the absence of immediate conflict did not equate to safety, but rather to a state of anticipation, as both sides remained aware that the situation could change rapidly. And within this atmosphere, the experience of those involved in convoy operations was shaped by a unique combination of routine and uncertainty, as long periods of steady movement were punctuated by moments of heightened alertness, when the possibility of interception or attack became more immediate. And for the crews of escorting vessels within the Royal Navy, this required a sustained level of focus and readiness, as their role was not only to respond to threats, but to anticipate them, using the information available to position themselves in a way that maximized their ability to protect the convoy. And this anticipation was informed by the lessons of previous engagements, including Matapan, where the importance of coordination and awareness had been clearly demonstrated, and as a result, convoy operations became a space in which these lessons were continuously applied and refined, contributing to a gradual improvement in effectiveness over time. And at the same time, the Regia Marina and their supporting forces sought to identify opportunities within this system, looking for moments when convoys might be vulnerable, whether due to gaps in escort coverage, changes in weather conditions, or the inherent challenges of maintaining coordination over extended distances. And this search for opportunity reflects the dynamic nature of convoy warfare, where the balance between protection and vulnerability is constantly shifting, influenced by a range of factors that extend beyond the immediate control of any single commander. And as these dynamics played out, they contributed to a broader understanding of how naval warfare operates within a system of continuous interaction, where the actions of one side influence the responses of the other in an ongoing cycle. And within this cycle, the concept of endurance becomes particularly important, as success is not determined solely by the outcome of individual encounters, but by the ability to sustain operations over time, maintaining the flow of resources while adapting to changing conditions. And for both sides, this required a level of resilience and flexibility that went beyond traditional notions of engagement, emphasizing the importance of persistence and adaptability in achieving strategic objectives. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the convoy system represents a fundamental aspect of the war in the Mediterranean, one that operates alongside and in conjunction with more visible engagements, shaping the broader context in which those engagements occur and providing a framework through which the ongoing struggle for control can be understood, not as a series of isolated events, but as a continuous process of movement, interaction, and adaptation, in which each convoy, each escort, and each attempt at interception contributes to the larger narrative of the conflict. And it is through this lens that the significance of convoy operations can be fully appreciated, as a critical component of the war effort that, while often less dramatic than major battles, plays an essential role in determining the outcome of the broader struggle at sea. Chapter 5, Segment 3, Air Power and the Next Evolution of Naval Warfare. As the Mediterranean campaign continued to evolve in the wake of the Battle of Cape Matapan, another dimension of warfare began to assert itself with increasing influence, gradually reshaping the way naval operations were conducted and understood. And this dimension was the integration of air power into the maritime environment, a development that did not replace traditional naval forces, but rather transformed the context in which they operated, adding a layer of complexity that extended both the reach and the vulnerability of fleets at sea. And within this emerging framework, the relationship between ships and aircraft became a central factor in determining the outcome of operations, as the ability to observe, track, and engage targets from the air introduced new possibilities for both offense and defense. And for the Royal Navy, the lessons of Matapan had already highlighted the importance of information and coordination, and the incorporation of air assets provided an additional means of achieving these objectives, allowing for a broader and more continuous awareness of the operational environment. And this awareness, in turn, enabled more effective decision-making, as commanders were able to base their actions on a more comprehensive understanding of the situation, rather than relying solely on the limited perspective available from the surface. And as aircraft began to operate in conjunction with naval forces, they extended the effective range of detection, making it possible to identify potential threats or opportunities at a much earlier stage. And this early detection was particularly valuable in the context of convoy operations, where the ability to anticipate and respond to potential interception attempts could significantly influence the outcome. And at the same time, the presence of air power introduced new challenges, as ships at sea were now exposed to threats that could originate from beyond the horizon, requiring the development of defensive measures that could address this expanded range of risk. And for the Regia Marina, the integration of air support became an essential component of their efforts to adapt to the changing conditions of the Mediterranean, as coordination with land-based aircraft provided a means of extending their operational capabilities and compensating for some of the limitations that had been revealed during earlier engagements. And within this context, the concept of coordination takes on an even greater significance, as the effective integration of air and naval forces requires a level of communication and planning that goes beyond traditional methods, ensuring that the actions of each component are aligned with the overall objectives of the operation. And as this integration continued to develop, it contributed to a broader transformation in the nature of naval warfare, one in which the boundaries between different domains became increasingly fluid, and where success depended not only on the capabilities of individual units, but on the ability to combine those capabilities in a way that maximized their collective effectiveness. And it is within this evolving environment that the next phase of the Mediterranean campaign can be understood, as a period of adaptation and innovation, where the lessons of past engagements were applied in new ways, and where the integration of air power played a central role in shaping the conduct of operations at sea. As the integration of air power continued to deepen within the Mediterranean theater, its influence began to extend beyond individual operations and into the broader strategic framework that guided naval planning, reinforcing the idea that control of the sea could no longer be considered in isolation from control of the air. And this realization marked a significant shift in the way naval warfare was conceptualized, as it required commanders to think in terms of interconnected systems rather than discrete elements, and within this interconnected framework, the actions of aircraft and ships became mutually reinforcing, with each contributing to the overall effectiveness of the other, and for the Royal Navy, this meant continuing to refine the coordination between their naval units and supporting air forces, ensuring that reconnaissance, protection, and offensive capabilities were integrated into a cohesive operational approach. And this integration was not without its challenges, as it required the development of new communication methods, the establishment of clear procedures, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, but over time, these efforts contributed to a more flexible and responsive system, one that could effectively leverage the advantages of both domains, and at the same time, the Regia Marina continued to explore ways to enhance their own use of air power, recognizing that the ability to coordinate effectively with aircraft was essential for maintaining their operational relevance in an environment where the dynamics of warfare were shifting. And as both sides worked to integrate these capabilities, the Mediterranean became a testing ground for new approaches, where the interaction between air and naval forces could be observed, analyzed, and refined, contributing to a broader understanding of how these elements could be combined to achieve strategic objectives. And within this context, the concept of reach becomes particularly important as air power extended the range at which forces could detect and influence one another, effectively shrinking the operational space and increasing the speed at which engagements could develop. And this increased speed placed additional demands on commanders and crews, as the window for decision-making became shorter, and the consequences of those decisions more immediate, and as a result, the ability to process information quickly and act decisively became a critical factor in maintaining an advantage. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the integration of air power represents not simply an addition to existing capabilities, but a fundamental transformation in the nature of naval warfare, one that redefined the relationship between different elements of the military and introduced new dimensions of complexity and opportunity. And it is through this transformation that the lessons of earlier engagements, including Matapan, were carried forward and expanded upon, shaping the conduct of operations in ways that would continue to influence the course of the war. And as the Mediterranean campaign progressed, the combined use of air and naval forces would play an increasingly central role in determining outcomes, illustrating the importance of adaptability and integration in navigating the evolving landscape of modern warfare, and providing a powerful example of how the interaction between different domains can redefine the possibilities of conflict at sea. Chapter 6, Segment 1. A new confrontation begins to form. In the months that followed the shifting balance of power in the Mediterranean, shaped in no small part by the outcome of the Battle of Cape Matapan, the sea did not settle into stability, but instead moved toward a new phase of tension, one that was less defined by a single dramatic encounter and more by a gradual accumulation of forces, intentions, and uncertainties. And within this evolving environment, both the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina found themselves navigating a landscape in which every movement carried potential consequences, and every decision was influenced by the memory of what had come before. And as ships began to move once again across the Mediterranean, they did so not in isolation, but as part of a broader pattern of preparation, as commanders sought to position their forces in ways that would allow them to respond effectively to whatever developments might arise. And this process of positioning was shaped by a combination of intelligence, experience, and anticipation, as each side attempted to interpret the intentions of the other, using the information available to construct a picture of the evolving situation. And within this process, the concept of uncertainty becomes central, as the absence of complete information creates a space in which multiple possibilities must be considered, each carrying its own set of implications, and it is within this space that much of the tension of this phase is generated, as the potential for confrontation exists not only in what is known, but in what is imagined, and as a result, the movements of ships take on a significance that extends beyond their immediate purpose, becoming signals that can be interpreted in different ways, influencing the decisions of those who observe them, And for the British, the confidence gained from previous successes provided a foundation upon which to build, allowing them to approach this new phase with a sense of readiness that was both practical and psychological. And this readiness was reflected in the way their forces were organized and deployed, with an emphasis on maintaining flexibility and the ability to respond quickly to changing conditions. And at the same time, the Italian Navy, while operating under the constraints imposed by earlier losses, continued to seek opportunities to assert its presence and protect its interests, recognizing that the Mediterranean remained a contested space in which the outcome was far from decided. And as these parallel processes unfolded, the stage was gradually set for a new confrontation, one that would not necessarily mirror the events of Matapan, but would nevertheless be shaped by the lessons learned during that engagement. And within this context, the importance of preparation becomes increasingly apparent, as the ability to anticipate and adapt to evolving conditions is a key factor in determining the outcome of any encounter. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the formation of a new confrontation is not a sudden event, but a process that unfolds over time, shaped by the interaction of multiple factors. And it is through this process that the next chapter of the Mediterranean campaign begins to take shape, building upon the foundations established by earlier engagements while introducing new dynamics that will influence the course of events to come. As this emerging confrontation continued to take form within the Mediterranean, the interplay between anticipation and action became increasingly pronounced, creating a dynamic in which each side sought not only to respond to developments, but to shape them in ways that would provide an advantage. And within this dynamic, the role of intelligence and reconnaissance assumed a central importance, as the ability to gather and interpret information about the movements and intentions of the opposing force became a key factor in determining how and when to act. And for the Royal Navy, this meant building upon the systems and practices that had proven effective in earlier engagements, integrating information from multiple sources to create a more comprehensive understanding of the operational environment. And this integration allowed them to identify patterns and anticipate potential developments, providing a foundation for decision-making that was both informed and adaptable. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of operating within an environment where the balance of information was not always in their favor, requiring them to rely on a combination of available intelligence and operational experience to navigate the uncertainties of the situation. And this reliance highlights the importance of adaptability, as the ability to function effectively under conditions of limited or imperfect information is a critical aspect of naval operations. And as both sides worked to interpret the evolving situation, their actions began to reflect a careful balancing of caution and initiative, as the desire to avoid unnecessary risk was weighed against the need to seize opportunities when they arose. And this balance is a defining feature of this phase, as it shapes the way in which forces are deployed and the manner in which engagements are approached. And within this context, the concept of readiness becomes particularly significant, as the ability to transition quickly from a state of preparation to one of action can determine whether an opportunity is successfully exploited or missed. And as ships moved through the Mediterranean, maintaining this readiness required not only technical and operational preparation, but a level of discipline and coordination that ensured all elements of the force were aligned with the broader objectives. And as these elements came together, the sense of an impending confrontation became more tangible, as the conditions that had been developing began to converge, creating a situation in which the likelihood of direct engagement increased. And yet, even at this stage, the exact nature and timing of that engagement remained uncertain, illustrating the inherent unpredictability of naval warfare, where the interplay of intention, information, and circumstance can produce outcomes that are difficult to foresee. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the formation of a new confrontation is as much about the processes that lead up to it as it is about the engagement itself, highlighting the importance of preparation, intelligence, and adaptability in shaping the conditions under which battles are fought, and providing a deeper understanding of how the broader dynamics of the Mediterranean campaign continue to evolve, setting the stage for the events that are yet to unfold. Chapter 6, Segment 2. When tension turns into action. There comes a moment in every prolonged period of tension when uncertainty gives way to movement, when anticipation condenses into decision, and within the Mediterranean theater, shaped by the lingering consequences of the Battle of Cape Matapan, that moment began not with a sudden explosion of activity, but with a subtle shift in patterns, a change in the rhythm of operations that, to those closely observing, signaled that the balance between preparation and action was beginning to tip. And, within this shift, the movements of ships took on a new urgency, no longer guided solely by precaution, but increasingly directed toward positions that suggested the possibility of engagement. And for the Royal Navy, this transition was approached with a measured sense of readiness, as the systems and practices developed in earlier phases were brought into alignment with the emerging situation, allowing for a response that was both deliberate and adaptable. And this adaptability was essential, as the precise nature of the developing encounter remained uncertain, requiring commanders to operate within a framework that could accommodate multiple possibilities, and at the same time, the Regia Marina found itself drawn into this shifting dynamic, as the need to protect vital interests and respond to perceived threats necessitated a movement toward positions that carried both opportunity and risk. And within this environment, the interplay between caution and initiative became increasingly pronounced as each side sought to act in a way that would maximize advantage while minimizing exposure. And it is within this interplay that the transition from tension to action can be understood, not as a single moment, but as a process in which a series of decisions gradually narrows the range of possible outcomes, bringing the opposing forces into closer proximity both physically and operationally. And as this process unfolded, the importance of timing became particularly evident, as the effectiveness of any action was closely tied to the moment at which it was taken, and this awareness of timing influenced not only the movements of ships, but the broader coordination of forces, as efforts were made to ensure that all elements were positioned to contribute effectively should an engagement occur. And within this context, the concept of alignment becomes central, as the ability to synchronize actions across multiple units is a key factor in translating readiness into effective action. And for the British, this alignment was supported by the integration of information and communication systems that allowed for a more cohesive approach, while for the Italian forces, the challenge lay in achieving a similar level of coordination under conditions that were shaped by both past experiences and present uncertainties. And as these dynamics converged, the sense of an impending encounter became increasingly tangible, not as a certainty, but as a strong possibility that influenced the decisions of those involved. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the transition from tension to action is defined by the gradual convergence of factors that bring opposing forces into a position where engagement becomes not only possible, but likely. And it is through this convergence that the next stage of the Mediterranean campaign begins to take shape, building upon the foundations of preparation and anticipation to create the conditions under which action can unfold. As the convergence of forces continued and the distance between intention and action narrowed, the Mediterranean once again became a space where decisions carried immediate and far-reaching consequences. And within this environment, the transition from readiness to engagement required not only the execution of plans, but the ability to adapt those plans in response to unfolding conditions. And for the Royal Navy, this meant drawing upon the lessons of previous encounters, including the Battle of Cape Matapan, to guide their approach, ensuring that their actions were informed by an understanding of how coordination, timing, and information could be leveraged to achieve an advantage. And this understanding was reflected in the way their forces were positioned and directed, with an emphasis on maintaining flexibility and the ability to respond quickly to changes in the situation. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of operating within a similarly dynamic environment where the need to act decisively was balanced against the risks associated with engagement, and this balance required a careful consideration of available information, as well as an awareness of the broader context in which the encounter was taking place. And as both sides moved closer to direct interaction, the role of communication became increasingly critical, as the ability to convey and interpret information in a timely manner was essential for maintaining coordination and ensuring that actions were aligned with overall objectives. And within this context, even small delays or misunderstandings could have significant consequences, highlighting the importance of clarity and efficiency in the exchange of information. And as the first indications of direct engagement began to emerge, whether through the detection of opposing forces or the confirmation of their positions, the abstract tension of anticipation gave way to the concrete reality of action. And it is within this moment that the nature of the encounter becomes most apparent, as the theoretical possibilities that had been considered during the period of preparation are replaced by the immediate demands of execution. And for those involved, this transition represents a shift in focus, from considering what might happen to responding to what is happening, and within this shift, the importance of training and discipline becomes evident, as the ability to act effectively under pressure is a key determinant of success, and as the engagement begins to take shape, it reflects not only the decisions made in the moment, but the cumulative effect of the preparation, experience, and adaptation that have characterized the preceding phases. And as we reflect on this transition, it becomes clear that the movement from tension to action is a defining aspect of naval warfare, one that encapsulates the interplay between anticipation and execution, and highlights the importance of being able to navigate both in order to achieve effective outcomes. And it is through this lens that the events of this phase can be understood, as a continuation of the broader narrative of the Mediterranean campaign, where each new development builds upon the foundations of what has come before, shaping the course of events in ways that are both immediate and enduring. Chapter 6, Segment 3. The engagement unfolds. When the long buildup of movement, anticipation, and positioning finally gave way to direct contact, the Mediterranean once again became a space where uncertainty was replaced by immediate consequence. And in the shadow of earlier encounters such as the Battle of Cape Matapan, both the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina entered into this new engagement with an awareness that each decision carried weight beyond the present moment, shaping not only the outcome of the encounter but the broader trajectory of operations within the Mediterranean. And as the first confirmations of opposing forces were received, the abstract notion of an impending confrontation solidified into a structured sequence of actions, each informed by training, doctrine, and the lessons of past engagements. And within this sequence, the initial moments were defined by the rapid alignment of information and response, as commanders sought to translate detection into positioning, ensuring that their forces were arranged in a manner that maximized effectiveness while preserving flexibility. And this process, though executed with precision, unfolded under conditions that were inherently dynamic, as the movements of one side influenced the options available to the other, creating a continuous interplay in which each adjustment prompted a corresponding reaction. And within this interplay, the importance of maintaining cohesion became increasingly evident, as the ability to act as a unified force provided a significant advantage in navigating the complexities of the engagement. And for the British, this cohesion was supported by a framework that emphasized communication and coordination, allowing individual units to operate with a clear understanding of their role within the broader operation. While for the Italian forces, the challenge lay in achieving a similar level of alignment under conditions that were shaped by both the immediate demands of the encounter and the lingering effects of earlier experiences. And as the engagement progressed, the environment itself played a role in shaping its course, with factors such as visibility, distance, and the relative positioning of forces influencing the timing and effectiveness of actions. And within this environment, the concept of tempo becomes central, as the pace at which decisions are made and executed can determine whether an opportunity is seized or lost. And as both sides sought to establish and maintain an advantageous tempo, their actions reflected a careful balance between speed and deliberation, ensuring that movements were both timely and aligned with broader objectives. And it is within this balance that the nature of the engagement begins to take shape, revealing a process that is both structured and fluid, where the interaction between opposing forces creates a dynamic that evolves moment by moment. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the unfolding of an engagement is not a linear progression. but a complex sequence of interactions, each influenced by a combination of preparation, perception, and adaptation. And it is through this sequence that the broader narrative of the Mediterranean campaign continues to develop, building upon the foundations established in earlier phases, while introducing new elements that will shape the course of events to come. As the engagement moved beyond its initial phase and developed into a more sustained interaction, the interplay between action and response became increasingly intricate, reflecting the depth of preparation and the complexity of the operational environment in which both the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina were operating. And within this evolving dynamic, the ability to interpret and act upon information in real time became a defining factor, as each side sought to anticipate the intentions of the other while adjusting their own actions to maintain an advantage. And this process of anticipation and adjustment created a feedback loop in which the outcomes of individual decisions influenced subsequent actions, shaping the trajectory of the engagement in ways that were both immediate and cumulative. And as this loop continued, the importance of adaptability became increasingly apparent, as the conditions of the encounter could change rapidly, requiring commanders and crews to respond with a level of flexibility that allowed them to navigate unexpected developments while maintaining alignment with their overall objectives. And for the British, the integration of information and coordination provided a framework that supported this adaptability, enabling them to adjust their approach as the situation evolved while preserving the cohesion that underpinned their effectiveness. And at the same time, the Italian forces demonstrated their own capacity for adaptation, working to respond to the challenges presented by the engagement while seeking opportunities to assert their presence and influence the course of events. And within this context, the concept of pressure takes on a nuanced form, as it is not only the result of direct action, but also the cumulative effect of sustained engagement, where the continuous demand for response can influence decision-making and shape the overall dynamics of the encounter. And as the engagement continued, this pressure contributed to a gradual refinement of actions on both sides, as each sought to identify and exploit patterns within the evolving situation. And it is through this process that the deeper structure of the engagement becomes visible, revealing a complex interaction in which the actions of each side are both independent and interconnected, influenced by a combination of internal objectives and external conditions. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the unfolding of an engagement is as much about the processes that govern action and response as it is about the actions themselves, highlighting the importance of understanding the interplay between information, coordination, and adaptation in shaping outcomes, and providing a lens through which the events of the Mediterranean campaign can be interpreted as part of a broader system of interaction, where each engagement contributes to an ongoing narrative of conflict, learning, and evolution. And it is within this narrative that the significance of individual encounters can be fully appreciated, not only for their immediate outcomes, but for the ways in which they inform and influence the course of events that follow. Chapter 7, Segment 1. The turning point emerges. In every extended engagement, there exists a phase where the balance, once fluid and uncertain, begins to lean in a particular direction, not abruptly, but through a gradual accumulation of small advantages. And within the evolving confrontation in the Mediterranean, shaped by the lingering influence of the Battle of Cape Matapan, this turning point did not announce itself with a single decisive moment, but instead revealed itself through a subtle shift in the rhythm of operations, a change in the way actions were taken and responses were formed. And as this shift began to take shape, both the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina found themselves operating within a framework that was increasingly influenced by the cumulative effects of the engagement thus far. And for the British, the integration of information, coordination, and adaptability began to translate into a more consistent ability to anticipate developments, allowing their actions to be guided not only by immediate conditions, but by an emerging understanding of patterns within the engagement. And this understanding enabled them to position their forces in ways that gradually constrained the options available to their opponents, creating a dynamic in which each movement was not isolated, but part of a broader strategy aimed at shaping the overall direction of the encounter. And within this dynamic, the concept of pressure becomes more refined, as it is no longer applied solely through direct action, but through the continuous influence exerted by positioning, timing, and the control of information, and as this pressure accumulated, its effects began to manifest in the responses of the Italian forces, where the need to address immediate challenges increasingly took precedence over the ability to maintain a cohesive and proactive approach, and this shift in focus is a key element of the turning point, as it illustrates how the balance of an engagement can change not through a single event, but through the gradual reorientation of priorities and capabilities, and as the Italian fleet worked to navigate these challenges, their actions reflected both resilience and constraint, as they sought to respond effectively within an environment that was becoming progressively more difficult to manage, and at the same time, the British forces continued to refine their approach, using the information available to them to adjust their actions in ways that reinforced their advantage. And within this process, the importance of tempo becomes increasingly evident, as the ability to maintain a consistent and effective pace of operations allows one side to dictate the terms of the engagement, shaping the conditions under which decisions are made and actions are taken. And as the tempo of the engagement began to align more closely with the British approach, it further contributed to the emerging shift in balance, creating a situation in which the direction of the encounter was increasingly influenced by their actions. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the turning point is not a moment, but a process, one that unfolds through the interaction of multiple factors and becomes visible only when viewed in the context of the engagement as a whole. And it is through this process that the broader narrative of the confrontation begins to change, setting the stage for the developments that will follow. As the turning point continued to develop within the engagement, its effects became more pronounced, influencing not only the actions of individual units but the overall structure of the confrontation. And within this evolving dynamic, the interplay between initiative and response took on a new significance, as the Royal Navy increasingly operated from a position where their actions were shaping the environment, while the Regia Marina found themselves responding within that environment. And this distinction between shaping and responding is central to understanding the nature of the turning point, as it reflects a shift in control that influences the range of options available to each side. And as this shift became more evident, the decisions made by commanders were increasingly framed by the need to address immediate challenges rather than to pursue broader strategic objectives. And while such decisions can be effective in managing specific situations, they also contribute to a narrowing of focus that can limit the ability to influence the overall direction of the engagement. And at the same time, the British forces continued to operate within a framework that allowed them to maintain alignment between individual actions and broader objectives, ensuring that each movement contributed to the overall strategy. And this alignment was supported by the effective use of communication and coordination, which enabled a level of cohesion that amplified the impact of their actions. And within this context, the concept of momentum becomes particularly important, as the advantages gained during earlier phases of the engagement were not only preserved, but extended, creating a cumulative effect that reinforced the emerging imbalance. And as this momentum continued to build, it further limited the ability of the Italian forces to alter the course of the engagement, illustrating how the interplay of initiative, coordination, and adaptability can shape the progression of an encounter in ways that become increasingly difficult to reverse. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the turning point represents a critical juncture in the narrative of the confrontation, one that marks the transition from a state of relative balance to one in which the direction of the engagement is more clearly defined. And it is through this transition that the subsequent developments of the encounter are shaped, as the conditions established during this phase influence the actions and outcomes that follow. And in this way, the turning point serves as both a culmination of what has come before and a foundation for what is yet to occur, highlighting the interconnected nature of the engagement and the importance of understanding how its various elements interact to produce a coherent and evolving narrative. And as the Mediterranean once again became a space where the outcome of events was being determined through the interaction of forces, the significance of this turning point became increasingly apparent, not as a single decisive moment, but as a process that revealed the underlying dynamics of the engagement and set the stage for its eventual resolution. Chapter 7, Segment 2. The advantage becomes decisive. As the engagement moved beyond the subtle emergence of a turning point, the balance that had once shifted gradually now began to solidify into something more defined, a state in which the accumulation of small advantages translated into a clearer and more decisive position, and within the Mediterranean theater, still shaped by the long shadow of the Battle of Cape Matapan. This phase marked the moment when control was no longer contested in equal measure, but increasingly directed by one side, and for the Royal Navy, this transition was not the result of a single bold action, but the continuation of a process in which coordination, information, and timing had been consistently aligned, allowing their forces to operate within a framework that maximized efficiency and minimized uncertainty. And as this framework continued to guide their actions, it enabled them to maintain a level of cohesion that reinforced their ability to shape the conditions of the engagement. And within this shaping, the concept of decisiveness begins to emerge, not as an abrupt or dramatic shift, but as the gradual reduction of uncertainty, where the range of possible outcomes narrows and the direction of the encounter becomes increasingly apparent. And this narrowing was reflected in the way British forces positioned themselves, ensuring that their movements constrained the options available to their opponents while preserving their own flexibility. And as a result, each action taken contributed to a broader pattern that reinforced their advantage, creating a dynamic in which the Italian forces were required to operate within an environment that was increasingly defined by external pressures. And for the Regia Marina, this phase represented a significant challenge, as the need to respond to immediate developments became more pressing, leaving less opportunity to influence the overall direction of the engagement. And within this context, the distinction between reacting and directing becomes central, as the ability to set the terms of an encounter is a key factor in achieving a decisive outcome. And as the Italian fleet found itself increasingly reacting to the movements and positioning of the British forces, their ability to alter the trajectory of the engagement became more limited. And this limitation was not solely a matter of physical positioning, but also of information and timing, as the advantage held by the British in these areas allowed them to anticipate and respond more effectively, further reinforcing their control over the situation. And as this process continued, the engagement began to take on a more defined structure, where the interactions between opposing forces were shaped by a set of conditions that favored one side. And it is within this structure that the decisive nature of the advantage becomes most apparent, as the interplay of actions and responses increasingly reflects an imbalance that is difficult to counter. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the transition from advantage to decisiveness is not a sudden leap, but a gradual consolidation of factors that together create a situation in which the outcome of the engagement becomes increasingly predictable, not in the sense that every detail is known, but in the sense that the broader direction is established, and it is through this consolidation that the narrative of the confrontation moves toward its resolution, guided by the dynamics that have been shaped over the course of the engagement. As the decisive advantage continued to take hold within the engagement, its effects became increasingly evident in the way actions unfolded and responses were formed, creating a dynamic in which the interplay between initiative and constraint defined the experience of both the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina. And within this dynamic, the concept of inevitability begins to emerge, not as a predetermined outcome, but as the result of a series of developments that progressively limit the range of viable options, guiding the engagement toward a conclusion that reflects the balance of factors at play. And for the British, the maintenance of initiative allowed them to continue shaping the conditions of the encounter, ensuring that their actions remained aligned with their objectives while adapting to any changes in the situation. And this adaptability, supported by effective coordination and communication, enabled them to sustain their advantage over time, reinforcing the momentum that had been established during earlier phases. And as this momentum continued to build, it further constrained the ability of the Italian forces to respond effectively, as each attempt to adjust to the evolving situation was influenced by the pressures imposed by their opponents. And within this context, The experience of operating under constraint becomes a defining feature of this phase, as the need to address immediate challenges takes precedence over the ability to pursue broader strategic goals. And this shift in focus highlights the importance of maintaining flexibility and awareness throughout an engagement, as the loss of these elements can contribute to a narrowing of options that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. And at the same time, the British forces continued to operate within a framework that allowed them to integrate individual actions into a cohesive whole, ensuring that each movement contributed to the overall effectiveness of the force. And this integration reflects a deeper understanding of how complex systems operate, where the interaction between components can create outcomes that exceed what might be expected from their individual capabilities. And as the engagement approached its later stages, the cumulative effect of these dynamics became more pronounced, illustrating how the interplay of initiative, coordination, and adaptability can shape the progression of an encounter in a way that leads toward a decisive outcome. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the emergence of a decisive advantage is a critical moment within the narrative of the confrontation, one that encapsulates the processes that have been unfolding throughout the engagement and provides a clear indication of the direction in which events are moving. And it is through this moment that the broader significance of the encounter can be understood, as a demonstration of how the balance of factors within a complex system can evolve over time, leading to an outcome that reflects the cumulative impact of decisions, actions, and interactions. And as the Mediterranean once again became a stage upon which these dynamics played out, the decisive nature of the advantage held by the British forces served as a powerful illustration of the importance of preparation, coordination, and adaptability in shaping the course of naval warfare, providing a foundation for understanding the events that would follow and the broader implications of the engagement. Within the context of the war as a whole, Chapter 7, Segment 3, the conclusion of the confrontation. As the engagement approached its final phase, the dynamics that had been building throughout the confrontation began to converge, creating a situation in which the outcome was no longer shaped by possibility, but by the momentum that had already been established, and within the Mediterranean, still influenced by the enduring lessons of the Battle of Cape Matapan. This convergence marked the transition from a state of active contest to one of resolution, where the interplay of actions and responses gave way to a clearer and more defined conclusion. And for the Royal Navy, the process of guiding the engagement toward this conclusion was characterized by a continuation of the principles that had shaped their approach from the outset, namely the integration of information, coordination, and adaptability into a cohesive operational framework. And as these principles were applied during the final stages, they allowed the British forces to maintain control over the direction and pace of events, ensuring that the conditions of the engagement remained aligned with their objectives. And within this framework, the concept of closure becomes central, as the focus shifts from influencing the course of the encounter to consolidating the outcomes that have already been achieved. And this consolidation involves not only the execution of final actions, but the careful management of risk, as the desire to secure a favorable outcome must be balanced against the potential consequences of unnecessary exposure. And as a result, the actions taken during this phase reflect a measured and deliberate approach, one that seeks to bring the engagement to a conclusion in a way that preserves the advantages that have been gained while minimizing the potential for disruption. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of navigating the final stages of the engagement under conditions that were increasingly constrained, as the cumulative effects of earlier developments limited their ability to alter the course of events. And within this context, the focus shifted toward managing the immediate situation and preserving what remained of their operational capability, highlighting the importance of resilience and adaptability even in the face of an unfavorable outcome. And as both sides moved toward the conclusion of the confrontation, the nature of the engagement itself began to change, with the intensity of interaction giving way to a more structured process of disengagement, as the conditions that had brought the forces together gradually began to dissipate. And within this transition, the significance of the engagement becomes more apparent, as it reveals not only the outcomes of the immediate encounter, but the broader patterns and dynamics that have shaped its progression. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the conclusion of a confrontation is not simply the end of action, but a process in which the results of that action are consolidated and integrated into the broader context of the conflict, providing a foundation for understanding both what has occurred and what is yet to come. In the aftermath of the confrontation, as the immediate pressures of engagement began to recede and the Mediterranean returned to a state of relative calm, the focus shifted once again from action to reflection, as both the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina sought to interpret the events that had just unfolded and to understand their implications within the broader context of the war. And within this process of reflection, the significance of the engagement was examined not only in terms of its immediate outcomes, but in relation to the patterns and principles that had shaped its progression. And for the British, the successful conclusion of the confrontation reinforced the effectiveness of their approach, providing further evidence of the value of coordination, information, and adaptability in achieving favorable results. And this reinforcement contributed to a continued sense of confidence that would influence future operations, shaping the way in which similar situations were approached and managed. And at the same time, the experience of the Italian forces provided important insights into the challenges of operating within a dynamic and evolving environment, highlighting the need for flexibility and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. And as these insights were considered and integrated into future planning, they contributed to a broader process of learning and adaptation that extended beyond the immediate context of the engagement. And within this broader process, the concept of legacy becomes increasingly important, as the events of the confrontation are not only remembered, but used as a reference point for understanding and navigating future challenges. And this legacy is shaped by both the tangible outcomes of the engagement and the intangible lessons that can be drawn from it, encompassing elements such as strategy, coordination, and the effective use of resources. And as these elements are examined and interpreted, they contribute to a deeper understanding of the nature of naval warfare within the Mediterranean, illustrating how individual encounters are part of a larger system of interaction that evolves over time. And as we reflect on the conclusion of this confrontation, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in the resolution of the immediate engagement, but in its role as part of an ongoing narrative, one that encompasses the interplay of forces, the evolution of strategy, and the continuous process of adaptation that defines the course of the war. And it is through this narrative that the events of the Mediterranean campaign can be fully appreciated, not as isolated incidents, but as interconnected elements within a complex and dynamic system, where each engagement contributes to a broader understanding of how conflicts unfold and how they are ultimately resolved. Chapter 8, Segment 1: The Shifting Balance of Power. In the wake of the confrontation that had unfolded across the Mediterranean, the sea itself appeared unchanged, its surface stretching outward in the same vast expanse as before. Yet beneath that familiar horizon, the balance of power had undergone a transformation that would influence every movement that followed, and within this evolving landscape, shaped in part by the enduring legacy of the Battle of Cape Matapan, the consequences of earlier engagements continued to ripple outward, altering not only the capabilities of the forces involved, but the way in which they perceived and approached the challenges ahead. And for the Royal Navy, the accumulation of successes had reinforced a framework of operation that emphasized coordination, information, and adaptability, allowing them to maintain a level of control over the Mediterranean that extended beyond individual engagements and into the broader structure of the campaign. And this control was not absolute, as the environment remained contested and dynamic, but it provided a foundation upon which further actions could be built, shaping the conditions under which future operations would take place. And within this framework, the concept of influence becomes central, as the ability to affect the movement of resources, the timing of operations, and the decisions of opposing forces becomes a key determinant of strategic advantage. And as British forces continued to operate within this environment, their actions reflected a growing confidence in their ability to shape these factors, allowing them to act with a degree of initiative that further reinforced their position. And at the same time, the Regia Marina found itself operating within a more constrained framework, where the need to preserve resources and avoid unfavorable engagements influenced the way in which operations were conducted, and this constraint, while limiting in certain respects, also encouraged a more deliberate and calculated approach as efforts were made to adapt to the changing conditions and to identify opportunities within a landscape that had become increasingly complex. And as these parallel processes unfolded, the Mediterranean became a space defined not only by the presence of ships, but by the interplay of strategies and perceptions, where each side sought to interpret the actions of the other and to respond in a way that aligned with their broader objectives. And within this interplay, the importance of perception becomes particularly evident, as the way in which each side understood the balance of power influenced their decisions and actions, shaping the trajectory of the campaign in subtle but significant ways. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the shifting balance of power is not a static condition, but a dynamic process, one that evolves through the interaction of multiple factors and is reflected in the continuous adjustment of strategies and operations. And it is through this process that the broader narrative of the Mediterranean campaign continues to develop, building upon the foundations established in earlier phases while introducing new dynamics that will influence the course of events to come. As the shifting balance of power continued to define the Mediterranean theater, its effects became increasingly visible in the patterns of movement and decision-making that characterized naval operations, revealing a landscape in which control was exercised not through constant confrontation, but through the strategic management of presence, timing, and opportunity. And within this landscape, the Royal Navy sought to consolidate their advantage by maintaining a consistent and adaptable approach, ensuring that their forces remained capable of responding to developments while also shaping the conditions under which those developments occurred. And this approach was reflected in the way resources were allocated and operations were planned, with an emphasis on flexibility and the ability to adjust to changing circumstances. And at the same time, the Regia Marina continued to navigate the challenges of operating within a constrained environment, where the need to balance risk and necessity influenced every aspect of their strategy. And within this context, the concept of adaptation becomes central, as the ability to respond effectively to changing conditions is a key factor in maintaining operational relevance. And as the Italian forces worked to adapt, they demonstrated both resilience and ingenuity, seeking to leverage the resources and opportunities available to them in a way that would allow them to continue contributing to the broader war effort. And as these efforts unfolded, they contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the balance of power, one that recognizes the importance of both capability and perception in shaping outcomes. And within this nuanced framework, the Mediterranean emerges as a space where control is not absolute, but negotiated, influenced by a continuous interplay of actions and responses that reflect the evolving conditions of the conflict. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the shifting balance of power is a defining feature of the campaign, one that shapes the way in which operations are conducted and the manner in which opportunities are identified and pursued. And it is through this shifting balance that the broader dynamics of the war can be understood, as a process of ongoing interaction and adaptation, where each development contributes to a larger narrative that extends beyond individual engagements and into the overall trajectory of the conflict. And as this narrative continues to unfold, the lessons of earlier encounters remain present, informing decisions and shaping expectations, and providing a foundation for understanding how the interplay of forces within the Mediterranean will continue to evolve, influencing the course of events in ways that are both immediate and far-reaching. Chapter 8, Segment 2, Adaptation and Preparation. As the Mediterranean settled into a quieter rhythm following the decisive shifts brought about by earlier confrontations, the nature of the conflict began to change in ways that were less immediately visible but no less significant. And within this evolving phase, the emphasis moved away from the intensity of direct engagement and toward the careful, deliberate process of adaptation, where each side sought to interpret the lessons of recent events and translate them into practical changes that would shape their future operations. And in the shadow of the Battle of Cape Matapan, these lessons carried a particular weight, as the outcomes of that engagement had highlighted the importance of coordination, awareness, and the effective use of available resources, and for the Royal Navy, this process of adaptation was characterized by a continuation and refinement of the methods that had already proven successful, as they sought to build upon their existing strengths while addressing any limitations that had been revealed, and this refinement involved not only changes in tactics, but also adjustments in the way information was gathered, interpreted, and applied, reflecting a broader understanding of the interconnected nature of naval operations, where each element contributes to the effectiveness of the whole. And as British forces worked to integrate these insights into their operational framework, they demonstrated a commitment to continuous improvement, recognizing that success in a dynamic environment depends on the ability to evolve in response to changing conditions, and at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of reassessing their own approach, as they sought to understand the factors that had influenced recent outcomes and to identify ways in which their strategies and operations could be adjusted to better align with the realities of the conflict. And within this process of reassessment, the importance of flexibility became increasingly apparent, as the ability to adapt to new information and changing circumstances emerged as a critical factor in maintaining operational effectiveness. And as these efforts unfolded, they contributed to a broader transformation in the way naval operations were conceived and executed within the Mediterranean, reflecting a shift toward a more integrated and responsive approach, where the emphasis was placed on the ability to anticipate and respond to developments rather than simply reacting to them. And within this context, the concept of preparation takes on a new meaning, as it is no longer limited to the accumulation of resources or the planning of specific actions, but encompasses a broader process of readiness, where forces are organized and positioned in a way that allows them to respond effectively to a wide range of potential scenarios. And as both sides engaged in this process of adaptation and preparation, the Mediterranean became a space defined by anticipation as much as action, where the focus was on shaping the conditions of future engagements, even as the memory of past encounters remained present, guiding decisions and influencing expectations in subtle but significant ways. As this period of adaptation continued to unfold, the preparations being made on both sides began to take on a more tangible form, manifesting in the movement of ships, the adjustment of operational patterns, and the refinement of strategies that would define the next phase of the conflict. And within this environment, the Royal Navy sought to consolidate the advantages they had gained by ensuring that their forces remained both capable and flexible, able to respond to developments while also maintaining the initiative that had characterized their earlier successes. And this effort involved not only the maintenance and coordination of naval assets, but also the continued development of the systems and processes that supported their operations, reflecting an understanding that effectiveness in modern warfare depends as much on organization and communication as it does on the physical capabilities of individual units. And as these preparations were carried out, they contributed to a sense of continuity, linking the experiences of past engagements with the expectations of those yet to come, and at the same time, the Regia Marina worked to rebuild and reorganize in a way that would allow them to remain an active and relevant force within the Mediterranean, despite the challenges they faced. And within this process, the emphasis was placed on identifying opportunities within a constrained environment, leveraging the resources available to them in a way that would maximize their effectiveness while minimizing exposure to risk. And as these efforts progressed, they highlighted the resilience of the Italian forces, demonstrating their ability to adapt and persist even in the face of adversity. And within this broader context, the Mediterranean emerges as a dynamic and evolving theater, where the balance of power is continually shaped by the interaction of preparation and opportunity. And as both sides continue to adapt and prepare, the stage is set for future engagements that will build upon the foundations established during this period. And it is through this process that the narrative of the conflict continues to develop, reflecting the ongoing interplay of strategy, adaptation, and execution that defines the course of war. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that preparation is not simply a precursor to action, but an integral part of the conflict itself, shaping the conditions under which events unfold and influencing the outcomes that are ultimately achieved. And in this way, the quiet, deliberate work of adaptation becomes as significant as the dramatic moments of engagement, providing the structure and context that allow those moments to occur, and ensuring that the forces involved are ready to meet the challenges that lie ahead, whatever form they may take. Chapter 8, Segment 3, The Long-Term Impact. As the Mediterranean campaign continued to unfold in the months that followed, the significance of earlier engagements did not fade into the background but instead became woven into the very structure of the conflict, influencing decisions, shaping expectations, and guiding the actions of those who operated within its waters. And within this evolving narrative, the legacy of the Battle of Cape Matapan remained a defining presence, not only because of the immediate outcomes it had produced but because of the deeper insights it had revealed about the nature of naval warfare in a modern, interconnected environment. And for the Royal Navy, the lessons of that engagement reinforced a strategic approach that emphasized coordination, awareness, and the effective integration of different elements into a cohesive whole, allowing them to operate with a level of confidence that extended beyond individual encounters and into the broader framework of the campaign. And this confidence was not based on certainty, as the environment remained dynamic and unpredictable, but on a demonstrated ability to adapt and respond effectively to changing conditions. And as British forces continued to apply these principles, they were able to shape the operational landscape in ways that provided them with a degree of influence over the timing and nature of future engagements. And within this context, the concept of continuity becomes particularly important, as the strategies and methods that had proven effective in earlier phases were carried forward and refined, creating a sense of progression that linked past experiences with future actions. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of operating within a framework that had been altered by the outcomes of previous encounters, requiring them to reassess their strategies and to identify ways in which they could adapt to the new conditions. And this process of reassessment was not limited to tactical considerations but extended to the broader understanding of how naval power could be applied within the Mediterranean, reflecting a recognition that the nature of the conflict was evolving and that success would depend on the ability to evolve alongside it. And as these parallel processes unfolded, the Mediterranean became a space defined by a complex interplay of continuity and change, where the influence of past events was balanced by the need to respond to present realities. And within this interplay, the long-term impact of earlier engagements becomes increasingly apparent as they continue to shape the decisions and actions of those involved, creating a framework within which the conflict develops and progresses. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the significance of these engagements lies not only in their immediate outcomes but in their enduring influence on the course of the war, providing a foundation for understanding how the dynamics of the Mediterranean campaign have been shaped and how they will continue to evolve in the future. As time moved forward and the Mediterranean remained an active and contested theater, the long-term consequences of earlier engagements began to manifest in more subtle but far-reaching ways, influencing not only the actions of individual units but the broader strategic considerations that guided the conduct of the war. And within this context, the Royal Navy continued to build upon the advantages they had gained, using their understanding of coordination, information, and adaptability to maintain a presence that extended beyond immediate engagements and into the broader structure of the campaign. And this presence allowed them to influence the flow of resources and the timing of operations in a way that contributed to a more favorable strategic position. And as these efforts continued, they highlighted the importance of maintaining momentum, as the ability to sustain and build upon earlier successes became a key factor in shaping the overall trajectory of the conflict. And at the same time, the Regia Marina worked to navigate the challenges posed by a changing environment, seeking to adapt their strategies and operations in a way that would allow them to remain effective despite the constraints they faced. And within this process, the importance of resilience and innovation becomes evident, as the ability to find new ways of operating within a constrained framework emerges as a critical factor in maintaining relevance. And as both sides continued to operate within this evolving landscape, the Mediterranean campaign took on a character defined by a continuous process of interaction and adaptation, where each development contributed to a broader narrative that extended beyond individual engagements and into the overall progression of the war. And within this narrative, the long-term impact of earlier encounters is reflected not only in the strategies that are employed but in the expectations and assumptions that guide decision-making, shaping the way in which future challenges are approached and managed. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the significance of these impacts lies in their ability to influence the course of events over time, creating a framework within which the conflict evolves and progresses, and providing a deeper understanding of how the interplay of forces within the Mediterranean has shaped the broader trajectory of the war. And it is through this understanding that we can fully appreciate the importance of these engagements, not as isolated moments in time, but as integral components of a larger and more complex narrative, one that continues to unfold as the war progresses, carrying forward the lessons and influences of the past into the challenges and opportunities of the future. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Expanding the Mediterranean War. As the Mediterranean campaign moved beyond the immediate consequences of earlier engagements, the scope of the conflict began to expand in both scale and complexity, transforming from a series of individual naval encounters into a broader and more interconnected struggle that encompassed multiple regions, forces, and objectives. And within this expanding framework, the legacy of the Battle of Cape Matapan continued to exert a subtle but persistent influence, shaping not only the strategies employed by those directly involved but also the wider perception of how naval power could be applied within the theater. And for the Royal Navy, this expansion presented both opportunities and challenges, as the need to maintain control over key areas of the Mediterranean required a careful balance between concentration and distribution of forces, ensuring that they remained capable of responding to developments across a wide and varied operational landscape. And this balance was achieved through a combination of strategic planning and operational flexibility, allowing British forces to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining a coherent overall approach. And within this context, the concept of connectivity becomes increasingly important, as the different elements of the campaign are linked together through a network of interactions that extend beyond the boundaries of individual engagements. And as these connections become more apparent, the Mediterranean emerges not as a collection of isolated battles, but as a dynamic system in which actions in one area can have far-reaching consequences in another. And as British forces continued to operate within this system, their ability to understand and navigate these connections became a key factor in maintaining their effectiveness. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of operating within a similarly complex environment, where the need to coordinate with other elements of the war effort and to respond to developments across a wide area required a level of adaptability and resilience that went beyond traditional approaches. And within this process, the importance of integration becomes clear, as the ability to align naval operations with broader strategic objectives emerges as a critical factor in achieving success. And as these parallel processes unfolded, the Mediterranean campaign took on a new dimension, one that reflected the increasing interconnectedness of the conflict and the need for a more comprehensive and coordinated approach to its conduct. And as we consider this phase, it becomes evident that the expansion of the war is not simply a matter of scale, but a transformation in the way it is understood and managed, requiring a deeper level of insight and a more nuanced approach to strategy and operations. And it is through this transformation that the true complexity of the Mediterranean campaign begins to reveal itself, offering a glimpse into the broader dynamics that define the course of the war. As the Mediterranean War continued to expand, the implications of this growth began to manifest in the evolving patterns of movement, coordination, and decision-making that defined the actions of both sides, creating a landscape in which the boundaries between individual engagements became increasingly blurred and the focus shifted toward the broader objectives that underpin the conflict. And within this landscape, the Royal Navy worked to maintain a strategic presence that extended across multiple areas, ensuring that their forces remained capable of influencing events wherever they occurred. And this presence was supported by a framework of coordination and communication that allowed for the effective integration of different elements, reflecting an understanding that success in such a complex environment depends on the ability to operate as part of a cohesive whole rather than as a collection of isolated units. And as British forces continued to refine this approach, they demonstrated a capacity for adaptation that enabled them to respond effectively to the challenges of an expanding conflict. And at the same time, the Regia Marina sought to navigate the demands of this broader environment by focusing on the efficient use of available resources and the identification of opportunities that could be leveraged to their advantage. And within this process, the importance of prioritization becomes evident, as the need to allocate resources in a way that aligns with strategic objectives requires a careful assessment of both risks and opportunities. And as these decisions were made, they contributed to the shaping of the operational landscape, influencing not only the actions of the Italian forces but also the responses of their adversaries. And within this dynamic interplay, the Mediterranean emerges as a theater defined by complexity and interdependence, where each action is part of a larger chain of events that extends beyond the immediate context in which it occurs. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the expansion of the war has fundamentally altered the nature of the conflict, transforming it into a multifaceted and interconnected struggle that requires a new level of understanding and adaptability from those who participate in it. And it is through this lens that the events of the Mediterranean campaign can be fully appreciated, not as isolated incidents, but as components of a larger and more intricate narrative, one that continues to evolve as the war progresses and new challenges and opportunities emerge, shaping the course of events in ways that are both immediate and far-reaching. Chapter 9, Segment 2: The Impact on Future Battles. As the Mediterranean conflict continued to expand in both scale and complexity, the effects of this transformation began to shape not only the immediate actions of the forces involved, but also the structure and nature of future engagements, creating a framework in which every decision, movement, and preparation was influenced by the accumulated experience of what had come before. And within this evolving environment, the enduring legacy of the Battle of Cape Matapan remained a central point of reference, providing a set of lessons and insights that informed the way in which subsequent operations were conceived and executed. And for the Royal Navy, this meant a continued emphasis on the principles that had proven effective, including coordination, situational awareness, and the integration of different operational elements into a unified and responsive system, allowing them to approach future battles with a level of preparation and adaptability that enhanced their ability to shape outcomes. And as these principles were applied across a wider range of scenarios, they contributed to the development of a more flexible and resilient operational framework, one that could accommodate the uncertainties and complexities of an expanding conflict. And within this framework, the concept of anticipation becomes increasingly important, as the ability to foresee potential developments and to prepare accordingly emerges as a key factor in maintaining strategic advantage. And as British forces worked to refine this capability, they demonstrated a growing capacity to influence not only the course of individual engagements but the broader trajectory of the campaign, shaping the conditions under which future battles would take place. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of adapting to an environment in which the expectations and assumptions that had guided earlier operations were being tested and, in some cases, redefined, requiring a process of reassessment and adjustment that extended beyond tactical considerations to encompass the broader strategic context of the war. And within this process, the importance of learning becomes particularly evident, as the ability to extract meaningful insights from past experiences and to apply them effectively in new situations is a critical factor in maintaining operational effectiveness. And as the Italian forces engaged in this process of learning and adaptation, they contributed to the development of a more nuanced understanding of the conflict, one that recognizes the interplay of multiple factors and the need for a flexible and responsive approach. And as these parallel processes unfolded, the Mediterranean became a theater in which future battles were not isolated events but the culmination of a continuous process of preparation, adaptation, and anticipation, reflecting the evolving nature of the conflict and the increasing complexity of the environment in which it was being fought. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the impact on future battles is not simply a matter of tactical adjustment but a transformation in the way in which the conflict is understood and approached, creating a foundation for the next stage of the campaign and shaping the course of events in ways that extend far beyond the immediate context of any single engagement. As the influence of this transformation continued to extend across the Mediterranean, the nature of future engagements began to reflect a deeper level of strategic integration, where the outcomes of individual battles were increasingly shaped by the broader framework within which they occurred. And within this interconnected environment, the Royal Navy worked to ensure that their operations remained aligned with their long-term objectives, using their understanding of coordination and adaptability to maintain a consistent and effective presence across the theater. And this alignment was achieved through a combination of planning and flexibility, allowing British forces to respond to immediate challenges while also contributing to the overall progression of the campaign. And as these efforts continued, they highlighted the importance of maintaining a balance between immediate action and long-term strategy, ensuring that each engagement contributed to a broader and more cohesive understanding of the conflict. And at the same time, the Regia Marina sought to navigate this evolving landscape by focusing on the efficient use of resources and the identification of opportunities that could be leveraged to offset the challenges they faced. And within this process, the concept of innovation becomes increasingly important, as the ability to develop new approaches and to adapt existing methods to changing conditions emerges as a key factor in maintaining operational relevance. And as these efforts were carried out, they contributed to a dynamic and evolving operational environment, where each side sought to anticipate and respond to the actions of the other, creating a continuous cycle of interaction and adaptation that defined the course of the conflict. And within this cycle, the impact on future battles becomes increasingly apparent, as the lessons and experiences of past engagements are integrated into the planning and execution of new operations, shaping the way in which those operations are conducted and influencing the outcomes that are achieved. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that the transformation of the Mediterranean campaign has created a framework in which future battles are not simply determined by the capabilities of the forces involved, but by their ability to operate effectively within a complex and interconnected system, where success depends on the integration of strategy, preparation, and execution. And it is through this integration that the broader trajectory of the conflict is shaped, as each engagement contributes to a larger and more comprehensive narrative, one that continues to evolve as the war progresses and new challenges and opportunities emerge, guiding the actions of those involved and influencing the course of events in ways that are both immediate and far-reaching. Chapter 9, Segment 3, Lasting Consequences. As the Mediterranean campaign continued to evolve and the passage of time placed distance between the present and the defining engagements of earlier phases, the consequences of those moments did not diminish but instead became more deeply embedded within the structure of the conflict, shaping not only the immediate actions of the forces involved but the broader patterns that would define the war in this theater. And within this enduring framework, the influence of the Battle of Cape Matapan remained unmistakable, not simply as a singular event, but as a turning point that revealed the strengths and vulnerabilities of the forces engaged, providing insights that would continue to guide decision-making long after the sounds of that confrontation had faded. And for the Royal Navy, the lasting consequences of that engagement were reflected in a sustained confidence in their operational approach, a confidence rooted not in complacency but in a demonstrated ability to integrate information, coordination, and adaptability into a cohesive and effective system. And as British forces continued to operate within the Mediterranean, this system allowed them to maintain a degree of influence over the flow of events, shaping the conditions under which engagements occurred and ensuring that they remained aligned with broader strategic objectives. And within this context, the concept of persistence becomes particularly important, as the ability to sustain and build upon earlier successes emerges as a key factor in maintaining long-term advantage. And as this persistence was applied across multiple phases of the campaign, it contributed to the development of a consistent and reliable operational framework, one that could be adapted to meet the challenges of an evolving conflict while retaining its core principles. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the ongoing challenge of operating within a framework that had been reshaped by earlier outcomes, requiring a continuous process of adaptation and reassessment as they sought to remain effective within a dynamic and often constrained environment. And within this process, the importance of resilience becomes increasingly evident, as the ability to endure and adapt in the face of adversity emerges as a defining characteristic of their efforts. And as these parallel processes unfolded, the Mediterranean became a theater in which the past and present were in constant dialogue, where the lessons of earlier engagements informed the decisions of the moment and shaped the expectations of the future. And within this dialogue, the lasting consequences of those engagements are revealed not only in the strategies that are employed but in the mindset and approach of those who participate in the conflict, creating a continuity that links individual moments into a broader and more cohesive narrative. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the true significance of these consequences lies in their ability to influence the course of events over time, shaping the way in which the conflict is understood and conducted, and providing a foundation for the developments that will follow as the Mediterranean campaign continues to unfold. As the Mediterranean War progressed further and the cumulative weight of its events began to shape a clearer picture of its overall trajectory, the lasting consequences of earlier engagements continued to manifest in ways that extended beyond the immediate concerns of individual operations, influencing the broader strategic landscape and contributing to the formation of a more defined and interconnected understanding of the conflict. And within this broader context, the Royal Navy maintained their emphasis on coordination and adaptability, ensuring that their operations remained aligned with the evolving demands of the theater while also contributing to a larger framework of strategic control. And this approach allowed them to sustain a level of effectiveness that extended across multiple phases of the campaign, reinforcing their position and enabling them to influence the direction of future developments. And as these efforts continued, they highlighted the importance of consistency, as the ability to maintain a coherent and adaptable strategy over time emerged as a key factor in shaping the overall outcome of the conflict. And at the same time, the Regia Marina continued to navigate the challenges posed by a dynamic and often restrictive environment, seeking to adapt their strategies and operations in a way that would allow them to remain an active and relevant force within the Mediterranean. And within this process, the importance of innovation becomes increasingly apparent, as the need to find new ways of operating within existing constraints drives the development of alternative approaches and solutions. And as these efforts unfolded, they contributed to a more complex and nuanced operational environment, where each side sought to anticipate and respond to the actions of the other, creating a continuous cycle of interaction and adaptation that defined the course of the campaign. And within this cycle, the lasting consequences of earlier engagements are reflected not only in the strategies that are employed but in the broader understanding of how the conflict is conducted, shaping the expectations and assumptions that guide decision-making and influencing the way in which future challenges are approached. And as we reflect on this phase, it becomes clear that these consequences are not confined to the past but continue to play an active role in the present, shaping the trajectory of the Mediterranean War and providing a framework for understanding its progression. And it is through this framework that the full significance of these events can be appreciated, not as isolated moments in time but as integral components of a larger and more complex narrative, one that continues to evolve as the war unfolds and new developments emerge, carrying forward the influence of the past into the challenges and opportunities of the future. Chapter 10, Segment 1, The Final Phase of the Campaign. As the Mediterranean campaign entered its final phase, the rhythm of the conflict began to shift once more, not toward sudden intensity but toward a gradual consolidation of everything that had come before, as the accumulated experiences, strategies, and outcomes of earlier engagements began to converge into a clearer understanding of the war's trajectory. And within this closing stage, the enduring influence of the Battle of Cape Matapan remained present, not as an isolated memory but as a foundational moment whose lessons continued to shape the way operations were conceived and executed. And for the Royal Navy, the transition into this final phase was characterized by a steady continuation of the principles that had guided their earlier successes, with an emphasis on coordination, adaptability, and the effective use of information to maintain a position of influence within the Mediterranean. And this influence was not exercised through constant engagement but through a careful management of presence and readiness, ensuring that British forces remained capable of responding to developments while also shaping the conditions under which those developments occurred. And within this framework, the concept of control becomes increasingly nuanced, as it is no longer defined solely by the outcome of individual battles but by the ability to sustain a favorable position over time, influencing the flow of events in ways that extend beyond immediate actions. And as British forces continued to operate within this environment, their actions reflected a growing confidence in their ability to maintain this control, allowing them to approach the final phase of the campaign with a sense of continuity and purpose that linked their present efforts with the achievements of the past. And at the same time, the Regia Marina faced the challenge of navigating this final phase within a framework that had been shaped by earlier outcomes, requiring a continued emphasis on adaptation and resilience as they sought to remain effective within a dynamic and often constrained environment. And within this context, the importance of endurance becomes particularly evident, as the ability to sustain operations and to respond to changing conditions emerges as a key factor in maintaining relevance. And as both sides moved through this final phase, the nature of the conflict itself began to change, with the emphasis shifting away from decisive confrontation and toward the gradual resolution of the broader strategic dynamics that had defined the campaign. And within this transition, the Mediterranean became a space where the outcomes of earlier engagements were consolidated and integrated into a larger narrative, one that reflected the cumulative impact of countless decisions and actions. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the final stage of the campaign is not simply an ending but a process of bringing together the various elements that have shaped the conflict, providing a framework for understanding its overall progression and significance. As the final phase of the Mediterranean campaign continued to unfold, the emphasis on consolidation and continuity began to reveal a clearer picture of the war's overall trajectory, as the patterns that had emerged over time coalesced into a more defined understanding of how the conflict had developed and where it was ultimately leading. And within this broader perspective, the Royal Navy maintained their focus on sustaining the advantages they had gained, ensuring that their operations remained aligned with their long-term objectives while also adapting to the evolving conditions of the theater. And this alignment was achieved through a combination of strategic planning and operational flexibility, allowing British forces to respond effectively to immediate challenges while also contributing to the broader progression of the campaign. And as these efforts continued, they highlighted the importance of maintaining a balance between action and stability, ensuring that the gains of earlier phases were preserved even as new developments emerged. And at the same time, the Regia Marina continued to operate within a framework that required careful management of resources and a constant awareness of changing conditions, seeking to adapt their strategies in a way that would allow them to remain an active participant in the conflict despite the challenges they faced. And within this process, the importance of persistence becomes increasingly evident, as the ability to continue operating effectively over time emerges as a key factor in shaping the overall outcome of the campaign. And as both sides continued to engage in this process of adaptation and consolidation, the Mediterranean campaign took on a character defined by its cumulative nature, where each phase builds upon the previous one, creating a continuous and interconnected narrative that reflects the complexity and dynamism of the conflict. And within this narrative, the final phase serves not as a simple conclusion but as a culmination, bringing together the various elements that have defined the campaign and providing a framework for understanding its significance within the broader context of the war. And as we reflect on this stage, it becomes clear that the true importance of the final phase lies not only in the outcomes it produces but in the perspective it provides, allowing us to see the Mediterranean campaign as a whole, with all its complexities, challenges, and transformations, and to appreciate the ways in which it has contributed to the larger story of the conflict, shaping the course of events in ways that extend far beyond the boundaries of the sea itself. Chapter 10, Segment 2, Legacy and Historical Significance. As the Mediterranean campaign moved beyond its active phases and into the realm of historical reflection, the events that had once unfolded in real time began to take on a new dimension, one shaped not by immediate necessity but by interpretation, understanding, and the search for meaning within the broader context of the war. And within this reflective space, the influence of the Battle of Cape Matapan emerged with renewed clarity, not merely as a decisive encounter but as a moment that encapsulated many of the defining characteristics of the campaign, including the importance of coordination, the role of information, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. And for the Royal Navy, the legacy of their actions during this period was closely tied to these principles, as their ability to integrate different elements into a cohesive and effective operational framework became a defining feature of their approach, one that would influence not only the Mediterranean campaign but the broader conduct of naval warfare during the conflict. And as historians and analysts began to examine these events, they often highlighted the ways in which British forces were able to translate strategic concepts into practical outcomes, demonstrating a level of effectiveness that extended beyond individual engagements and into the overall structure of the campaign. And within this context, the concept of innovation becomes particularly important, as the ability to develop and apply new methods in response to evolving challenges emerges as a key factor in shaping the legacy of the campaign. And as these innovations were identified and analyzed, they contributed to a deeper understanding of how modern naval warfare operates, illustrating the ways in which technology, communication, and organization can be combined to create a more effective and responsive system. And at the same time, the Regia Marina played an equally important role in shaping the historical significance of the campaign, as their experiences and responses provided valuable insights into the challenges of operating within a dynamic and often constrained environment, highlighting the importance of resilience, adaptability, and the ability to learn from both success and adversity. And as these perspectives were integrated into the broader narrative of the war, they contributed to a more balanced and comprehensive understanding of the Mediterranean campaign, one that recognizes the contributions and experiences of all those involved. And as we consider this phase, it becomes clear that the legacy of the campaign is not defined solely by its outcomes but by the lessons it provides, offering insights into the nature of conflict and the factors that influence its progression. And it is through these lessons that the historical significance of the Mediterranean campaign can be fully appreciated, not as a series of isolated events but as a complex and interconnected narrative that continues to inform our understanding of the past. As the historical significance of the Mediterranean campaign continued to be examined and understood, its legacy began to extend beyond the immediate context of the war, influencing the development of naval doctrine, strategic thinking, and the broader understanding of how conflicts are conducted and resolved. And within this expanded perspective, the experiences of both the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina contributed to a more comprehensive understanding of the complexities of modern warfare, highlighting the ways in which different factors, including technology, coordination, and adaptability, interact to shape outcomes. And as these insights were integrated into post-war analysis and planning, they played a role in shaping the evolution of naval strategy, influencing the way in which future conflicts would be approached and managed. And within this context, the concept of continuity becomes increasingly important as the lessons of the Mediterranean campaign are carried forward and applied to new situations, creating a link between past experiences and future developments. And as this process unfolded, it contributed to the formation of a body of knowledge that extends beyond the specific circumstances of the campaign, providing a framework for understanding the broader dynamics of conflict and the factors that influence its course, and at the same time, the legacy of the campaign is also reflected in the way it is remembered and interpreted. As historians, scholars, and the public engage with its events and seek to understand their significance within the larger narrative of the war, and within this process of interpretation, the Mediterranean campaign emerges as a key chapter in the story of the conflict, one that illustrates both the challenges and the possibilities of operating within a complex and dynamic environment. And as we reflect on this legacy, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in the events themselves but in the understanding they provide, offering insights into the nature of strategy, the importance of adaptability, and the ways in which individual actions contribute to broader outcomes. And it is through this understanding that the Mediterranean campaign continues to resonate, serving as a reminder of the complexities of conflict and the enduring relevance of the lessons it provides. And as we consider the broader implications of these events, we are reminded that history is not simply a record of what has happened, but a source of insight and understanding that can inform our perspective on the present and guide our approach to the future, ensuring that the experiences of the past continue to have meaning and relevance in the world that follows. Chapter 10, Segment 3, The Final Reflection. As the Mediterranean campaign draws to its quiet and reflective conclusion, the vast expanse of the sea once again appears calm, its surface undisturbed by the urgency and intensity that had once defined it. Yet beneath that calm lies the memory of a conflict that reshaped not only the course of the war but the understanding of naval power itself, and within this final reflection, the enduring presence of the Battle of Cape Matapan remains unmistakable, not as a moment frozen in time but as a point of transformation, where the lessons of coordination, awareness, and adaptability came together to demonstrate what was possible when strategy and execution aligned with precision and purpose. And for the Royal Navy, this moment became part of a larger narrative of effectiveness and evolution, where each engagement contributed to a growing understanding of how to operate within a complex and ever-changing environment. And as the campaign progressed toward its conclusion, this understanding allowed them to maintain a sense of continuity, linking their early actions with the outcomes that would ultimately define their role in the Mediterranean. And within this continuity, the concept of perspective becomes central, as the distance created by time allows the events of the campaign to be seen not as isolated incidents but as interconnected elements within a broader and more cohesive story. And as we adopt this perspective, the significance of each decision, each movement, and each moment of adaptation becomes more apparent, revealing the intricate web of cause and effect that shaped the course of the conflict. And at the same time, the Regia Marina emerges within this narrative not simply as an opposing force but as an integral part of the story, whose actions, challenges, and responses contributed to the complexity and dynamism of the campaign. And within this shared narrative, the interplay of strategy and circumstance becomes a defining feature, illustrating how the outcomes of the conflict were shaped not by a single factor but by the interaction of multiple elements, each influencing and being influenced by the others. And as the final phase of the campaign is brought into focus, the Mediterranean itself becomes a symbol of this interplay, a space where the boundaries between action and consequence, between planning and execution, are continually negotiated and redefined. And within this space, the legacy of the campaign takes on a deeper meaning, one that extends beyond the immediate context of the war and into the broader understanding of how conflicts unfold and how they are ultimately resolved. And as we consider this final reflection, it becomes clear that the true significance of the Mediterranean campaign lies not only in its outcomes but in the insights it provides, offering a window into the nature of conflict and the factors that shape its progression. And it is through this window that we are able to see the campaign not simply as a series of events but as a complex and evolving narrative, one that continues to resonate long after the final moments of action have passed. As the final words of this story settle into silence, the Mediterranean remains, vast and unchanging in appearance, yet forever marked by the events that unfolded across its waters. And within this quiet conclusion, the legacy of the campaign continues to echo, not through the sound of conflict but through the understanding it leaves behind, shaping the way in which history remembers and interprets what took place. And for both the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina, the conclusion of the campaign represents not an end but a point of transition, where the experiences of the past are carried forward into the broader narrative of the war, influencing the decisions and actions that will follow. And within this transition, the importance of memory becomes increasingly evident, as the lessons learned during the campaign are preserved and applied to future challenges, ensuring that the insights gained are not lost but continue to inform the evolving understanding of naval warfare. And as these lessons are carried forward, they contribute to a legacy that extends beyond the individuals and moments that define the campaign, becoming part of a larger body of knowledge that shapes the way in which conflicts are approached and understood. And within this broader context, the Mediterranean campaign emerges as more than a chapter in history. It becomes a reference point, a source of insight into the complexities of strategy, the importance of adaptability, and the ways in which human decisions and actions interact with the forces of circumstance to shape the course of events. And as we reflect on this final moment, there is a sense of completion, not in the sense that all questions have been answered or all outcomes fully understood, but in the recognition that the story has reached a point where its elements have come together to form a coherent and meaningful whole. And within this whole, the interplay of past and present, of action and reflection, creates a narrative that continues to resonate, offering not only an account of what has happened but an understanding of why it matters. And as the Mediterranean fades into the distance, its waters once again calm and silent, the echoes of the campaign remain, carried forward in the memory of those who study and remember, a testament to the enduring impact of the events that took place and the lessons they continue to provide. And it is within this enduring impact that the true conclusion of the story can be found, not as an ending but as a continuation, a reminder that history is not confined to the past, but lives on in the understanding and perspective it offers to those who look back upon it. And as the story comes to a close, the silence that now rests over the Mediterranean feels almost unreal, because beneath those calm waters lies a history shaped by strategy, courage, uncertainty, and decisions made in moments that changed everything. What we've explored today is more than just a battle, more than just ships and outcomes. It's a glimpse into how wars are fought not only with weapons, but with intelligence, coordination, and the will to adapt when everything is at stake. The events at Matapan remind us that history is not just a record of the past. It is a series of turning points that continue to influence how we understand conflict, leadership, and the consequences of human choices. And even now, decades later, those lessons still echo, quietly but powerfully, across time. If you found this story insightful, if it helped you see history in a deeper and more cinematic way, then make sure to subscribe to the channel. There's much more to uncover. Stories that are just as powerful, just as haunting, and just as important to remember. Until next time, thank you for watching.